Welcome to this day 3 of this wonderful conference. You're all very welcome. The theme for this morning session and obviously carries on through the conference as a whole. The theme today is knowledge. Before we start, just one announcement I do need to make is that we have been asked to keep to time. I know we started a little bit late, but I just really needed to get people come in. But we will finish on time because it's causing real issues that we aren't quite doing that. So 10:15 we will be finishing, but we started pretty much on time, so that's great. Thank you. Okay, I just want to say a few words on the theme, and then I will move on to introduce our keynote speaker. The theme, as I said, is knowledge. This is a hugely important topic in so many ways, and to all people, of course, not least in the context of feminist knowledge. I mean, how hard has it been? How hard is it to achieve legitimacy for feminist knowledge? How hard has it been? How hard is it for feminist activists and thinkers, scholars, speakers to be recognized by whom as legitimate speakers and owners of knowledge? I mean, these are really big questions, and they really don't go away, and I think rumble through so many of our discussions here. But particularly for us here at this conference, of course, the questions we need to be working with, thinking about, is how is AI and digitalization impacting on all the different ways that we produce knowledge, but also in ways that we want to resist some knowledges. We're teachers, we're educators, we're students, we're involved with feminist journals, whether as authors, prospective authors, readers, editors, and clearly AI and digitalization are having a major impact. So this is such an important theme for us, I think, in this conference. But let me move on to introduce our speaker for today. This is Eileen Hunt, who is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame in the USA. She is a political theorist, and her scholarly interests range from ancient to modern political thought, feminism, the family, rights, ethics of technology, and philosophy and literature. So a very wide range there. She's published 5 solo-authored books, including Artificial Life After Frankenstein, which won the David Easton Award from the Foundations of Political Theory section of the American Political Science Association in 2022, and most recently this year, The First Last Man, her book, The First Last Man, Mary Shelley and the Post-Apocalyptic Imagination. She's also published 5 edited or co-edited books and has several editions of the works of Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft currently in progress for Oxford University Press. Her next major solo authored project is a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft for Basic Books. Her essays, political analyses, and opinion pieces have appeared in Aeon magazine, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Chicago Tribune, Public Seminar, and The Times Literary Supplement. Eileen, Professor Hunt, will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open for question and answers, or question and discussion. And the title of her talk is Mary Shelley, AI, Digitalization, and Feminist Futures. Thank you, Eileen.
Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I was so tremendously honored to be invited to be part of this exciting and important international hybrid conference on AI, digitization, and feminist futures, sponsored by the journals Feminist Africa and International Feminist Journal of Politics. My most recent books are right on topic for the ideas we are discussing this week in beautiful Maputo, Mozambique. In 2020, I published Artificial Life After Frankenstein, which roots 21st century debates on artificial intelligence and genetic engineering in Mary Shelley's two foundational works of modern political science fiction, her 1818 Gothic novel Frankenstein and her 1826 post-apocalyptic pandemic novel The Last Man. Earlier this year, I published the concluding volume in my trilogy on Mary Shelley and feminist political philosophy with the University of Pennsylvania Press. The first Last Man, Mary Shelley and the Post-Apocalyptic Imagination. It explores how Shelley's life and writing spurred the spread of the now global literary and filmic figure of the Last Man, or the seemingly solitary survivor of a massive human exacerbated disaster, who somehow holds out hope of sustaining life on the planet. The final frame of her novel sees this last man, an avatar for Mary Shelley herself, leaving the empty ruins of Rome after a global plague and setting out to sea to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in search of other survivors with whom he surmises may be safe on an island somewhere in the Indian Ocean off the southeastern shore of Africa. Mary Shelley's post-apocalyptic figure of the last man is as much a last woman, or, as I render it in gender hybrid terms, a last woman, because her visionary allegory of the seemingly sole survivor of a global plague is rooted in the young widowed author's own heroic story of enduring a string of tragic losses of 3 children to disease, and her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, to drowning. In my talk today, I will argue that Mary Shelley's strangely hopeful idea of the last human survivor who never gives up their quest to find community, love, and justice with others across borders of culture and nation can aid us in navigating and even avoiding real and anticipated disasters of our own design, including those related to fast-paced and often overwhelming developments in AI and digital technologies. But first, let's turn to the story of how Mary Shelley predicted so many of our challenges with AI and digital technologies with her far-seeing work of feminist political science fiction, Frankenstein. I published in time for the bicentennial of Frankenstein in 2018, the first book in my pen press trilogy, Mary Shelley and the Rights of the Child. Building on generations of feminist scholarship, I made a 2-level argument. First, following the work of Anne K. Malloy and Joyce Carol Oates, I argued that Frankenstein's creature is a child who is made and abandoned by his father scientist and then suffers, falls into a solitary life of misanthropy and crime, and ultimately becomes monstrous due to the lack of love and care in his childhood. Secondly, I used this premise of reading the creature as a child to put forward a new reading of the novel itself. That is, the teenage mother, Mary Shelley, designed the narrative structure of Frankenstein to provoke a series of thought experiments in the mind of the reader about the rights of the child, which boil down to the provocative question: do children, no matter how they are made, or how they look, or where they come from, have a fundamental right to share and experience love? In my 2020 follow-up book, Artificial Life After Frankenstein, I extended this argument to apply to forms of artificial intelligence that mimic or exceed human language capabilities. I compared the creature to a form of deep learning, that recognizes faces and speech patterns, translates languages, reads handwriting, plays strategic games, and controls robotic prostheses. In the creature's case, these are the limbs of dead humans and other animals, presumably sewn together to create his 8-foot-tall frame by his father scientist, Victor Frankenstein. In this image on the left, you will see the first illustration ever created for Shelley's novel, commissioned for her 1831 third edition, the only edition over which she had total editorial control. In this image, the creature appears as she described him in the novel, an anatomically perfect but grotesquely giant man made from the parts of human corpses and slaughtered animals, with eerily transparent skin and other skeletal features that startle his scientist father and make Victor Frankenstein flee in fear of his creation. Beginning in Mary Shelley and the Rights of the Child, I have argued that Frankenstein not only raises questions for children's and other human rights, but also raises a vital series of technology ethics questions that are now on everyone's minds, especially with the rise of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology and its rogue use on twin girls in China in 2018, the design and use of mRNA vaccines for the COVID pandemic and now new strains of the bird flu, and the widespread release of ChatGPT and other forms of generative AI. These four Frankensteinian techno-political questions are, first and foremost, what are human responsibilities towards the creations we make? Secondly, individually and collectively, how should we respond to our scientific and technological creations that seem to be as smart or smarter than we are? Thirdly, do we have duties to care for the products of our technological artifice if they scare us or even seem monstrous with their sheer power or intelligence? And finally, how can we overcome or avoid disasters of our own design without losing sight of the central place of technology in our very humanity? Through her long exposure to various images of monstrosity in Enlightenment-era works of political science, from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan to her mother, the feminist abolitionist Mary Wollstonecraft's critiques of slavery and other forms of tyranny, the 18-year-old Shelley conceived a story that presciently addresses our 21st century techno-political questions. In the summer of 1816, Shelley trekked to Geneva with her lover Percy, their child William, and her stepsister Claire to visit Claire's lover Lord Byron. After a ghost story competition with Byron, his doctor John Polidori, and Percy, Shelley had a waking nightmare on the moonlit shores of Lake Geneva. This nightmare gave her the concept for what would become her 3-volume first novel, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. This novel has become famous across fields of study for its two iconic visions of the human monster, the humanoid automaton and the surveillance machine. Shelley's first vision of the human monster is of Frankenstein's creature as an artificially formed humanoid automaton, endowed with godlike intelligence and consciousness of the moral and social import of his and other creatures' often bad decisions and destructive actions. Her second vision of the human monster is the creature as an artificially formed surveillance machine that has the power to invisibly observe and manipulate the lives and choices of other creatures, yet fails due to lack of full information and proper education to use its godlike intelligence in a way that serves the interests of either itself or those with whom it interacts. Rooted in British Enlightenment thought from Hobbes to Wollstonecraft, these two visions of AI and Frankenstein opened the door to the general 21st century conception of artificial intelligence as both human-made and potentially monstrous and tyrannical in all the same ways its human makers are. But unlike recent fear-mongering theories of AI that speculate an emergent superintelligence that will destroy humanity, Shelley gives us philosophical resources for critically examining our apocalyptic fears of making artificial beings that are smarter than we are. Shelley's Frankenstein helps us to see we are all artificially formed creatures who are empirically made and shaped by our social and cultural environment, and in need of care, love, guidance, and appropriate education to learn to operate ethically within that wider environment. Considered as a humanoid automaton, the creature is designed to have sufficient intelligence, strength, and autonomy to minimally function without his maker's guidance. But when Victor Frankenstein abandons him soon after his birth due to his perceived ugliness and deformity relative to other people, the creature quickly falls out of line with society's expectations for human behavior and social belonging. He is not born, but rather becomes a monster due to neglect and abuse by people who perceive him as monstrous. Shelley used the predicament of the abandoned creature to theorize a pernicious feedback loop that plagues freedom-oriented theories of modern education. When a creature is capable of autonomy and yet is wholly abandoned to its own desires, it ends up falling outside or outright rebelling against the program or plan of its maker or educator. Shelley's educational and political theory of how the artifice of society turns the intelligent machinery of the human mind toward monstrosity and revolution has its roots in British Enlightenment ideas, from the fall of Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost to Edmund Burke's horrified depiction of, quote, the vilest of women, unquote, storming Versailles during the October days of the French Revolution. The same primarily British Enlightenment sources shape Shelley's vision of the humanoid automaton's potential to transmogrify into a dangerous and rogue surveillance machine. When the creature is abandoned by his father scientist, he seeks refuge in a hovel attached to a cottage in the woods in Germany. On the right side of the slide, you will see a depiction of this eerie image from the novel, as performed by Johnny Lee Miller as the creature in National Theatre Live's 2012 Frankenstein. Through a hole in the wall, the abandoned creature invisibly observes the de Lacys, a family of immigrants living in political exile from France and Turkey. He surveys his narrow social environment in order to learn how to read and speak, but the myopic one-sidedness of his lived experience leads him to botch his attempt to connect with the family. When they reject him like his father scientists did, he devotes himself to revenge against them and his maker. While the creature has the intelligence and autonomy to learn solely from empirical observation, his lack of social education leads him down a monstrous road of misanthropy, murder, and misery. He uses his super speed, strength, and intelligence to invisibly observe the people whom he seeks to harm, then strikes them down when they least expect it. In this light, we might see the creature as a kind of invisible, data-driven, myopically focused, artificially created intelligence that undermines the programming of its maker when it is neglected or untrained. But what makes Frankenstein's creature distinctive in the history of ideas is not simply his similarities to other Enlightenment-era automata, for there were plenty of other automata made monstrous in Enlightenment political thought before him. The late 17th century English poet John Milton described Satan, for example, as a devilish engine. whose fall from heaven and abandonment by God turns his once angelic mind into a demonic intelligence that is hell-bent on surveying his rivals, Adam and Eve, in Eden in order to enact revenge against their maker. Soon after Milton's Paradise Lost, the philosopher John Locke promulgated his computer-like idea of the mind as a blank slate that could only be written upon or programmed by sensory experience or the input of empirical data. This Lockean idea of the mind as a tabula rasa paved the way for 18th century educational practices to assume that lived experience ineluctably shaped human beings for the better or for the worse. One of the most popular English works of fiction ever published, Daniel Defoe's 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe, illustrates the power and danger of the Lockean idea of the mind as a blank slate. By having a shipwrecked Briton enslave the first human he meets on a desert island off the coast of South America, in order to train him to become his friend and servant. Crusoe's man, Friday, quickly becomes a kind of automaton under the isolated and all-commanding surveillance of his British imperial master. More explicitly mechanical automata, along the lines of what we would call supercomputers or AI-equipped robots, also populate Enlightenment-era fiction. Jonathan Swift's 1732 satire, Gulliver's Travels, imagines an engine that automatically produces books on everything from science to politics. And in the French predecessor text to Shelley's novel, a 1790 short story by Nogaret, a man named Frankenstein makes a flute-playing automaton to help him woo a wife. Compared to these various types of Enlightenment-era automata, what makes Shelley's creature a distinctive and pivotal source for contemporary conceptions of AI is the way that he becomes a monstrous surveillance machine like Milton's Satan, hell-bent on hunting down and punishing the family of his father maker after his cruel programmer abandons him without sufficient guidance to operate successfully or ethically on his own. What Shelley theorizes so vividly in Frankenstein is what goes wrong when there is no good guidance on how to develop the blank slate of the human mind. Shelley expresses through the poetic voice of the abandoned creature that the lack of love and care turns people into monsters. Evil is not inborn, but rather ingrained by the privations of society and education. Having taught himself to read with a stolen copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, the creature comes to identify with Satan, bewailing that he was born good, but became evil due to the tyranny of his father. Like Frankenstein's creature, Shelley was a deep reader of Milton, just as her mother Wollstonecraft had been before she died soon after giving birth to the future author of Frankenstein. Like her lost mother and intellectual muse Wollstonecraft, Shelley was born and raised in the Anglican tradition, but was also inspired by nonconformist Christian traditions such as the Glazite Church in Dundee. At the Glazite Church, which she attended between 1812 and 1814, she participated in love feasts on Sundays, which consisted of meals of soup and bread shared among the congregation in remembrance and ritualistic restoration of the Last Supper of Jesus with his apostles. In her young womanhood, Shelley developed an unorthodox spiritual view built on her deep reading of her mother Wollstonecraft in studious translation of Spinoza, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Cicero, and Plato. Love and sympathy for the existential plight of one's fellow creatures and their shared moral formation by tragedy, injustice, and suffering was at the center of this deterministic spirituality, which she expressed most plaintively in her unpublished journals, especially her poignant Journal of Sorrow, written after Percy's death from drowning in 1822. Shelley sought to reconcile herself with the tragedies of her past, especially her troubled family life with Percy, which saw the deaths of 3 of their young children to genetic and infectious diseases. She did this by accepting and even loving all things, good and bad, as part of the warp and woof of the world as it has been, is, and must be created. In contrast to the unorthodox spirituality of his second wife, Mary, Percy Shelley was an avowed atheist who was expelled from Oxford for publishing a treatise on the taboo subject in 1811. Percy's deterministic Spinozan view of the ineluctable nature of the cosmos was secular, empirical, and atheistic, although metaphysical and spiritual in its romantic idealization of nature, and politically progressive in its radical vision of the potential to realize human freedom in the structure of self-governing constitutional republics. The poet helped to edit Frankenstein and made one important suggestion that shaped Shelley's vision of the creature as a humanoid automaton. While Shelley originally had the creature come to life like Milton's Adam with an innate power to speak, Percy suggested that he learn language only through experience. This editorial suggestion may have spurred Shelley to make a compromise between her original view of the creature as verbal from birth and Shelley's view of him as a kind of anti-Adam or modern Lockean blank slate, who cannot instantly name and command other animals, but must acquire language and other knowledge through empirical observation over time. This compromise yielded a visionary conception of AI for Frankenstein's creature in Shelley's imagination. Frankenstein's creature became a humanoid automaton with a high-powered mental engine for language acquisition. As a kind of data-driven, machine-learning supercomputer, he teaches himself to speak and read by observing the multilingual de Lacy family teach a religious exile from Turkey, Saifi, how to read French from Volney's 1791 book, Ruins of Empires. The creature goes on to read Paradise Lost in French by the age of 2. Through a creative integration of the ideas of her parents and husband within her own distinctively feminist Gothic imagination, Mary Shelley created a vital, new, dual-sided vision of the human monster as a tragic wrongdoer who is still potentially redeemable through the sharing of sympathy, love, and solidarity. Percy's atheism and materialism and philosophical interest in Lockean epistemology shaped Shelley's vision of the creature as a humanoid automaton with superintelligent language capacity. But it was Wollstonecraft who hovered most forcefully in the background of her daughter's Gothic imagination. Shelley followed her mother in navigating an unorthodox spiritual path between Anglicanism and nonconformity, which makes the explicitly Miltonic image of the fallen angel with godlike intelligence manifest as the creature in Frankenstein. She also followed her mother in her concern for charting the psychological sources for the social oppression of women by tyrannical systems of cultural and educational surveillance and control. In the first volume of her journals from 1814 to 1815, Shelley recorded reading Wollstonecraft's final unfinished novel, The Wrongs of Woman, or Maria. This novel tragically was left on Wollstonecraft's desk when she went to her childbed to bear Mary Shelley, and she died 11 days later from sepsis. The novel, The Wrongs of Woman, is set in an asylum. The lead character is trapped there by her abusive husband. The feminist literary critic Anne Mallour argued that the first-person narratives of the imprisoned Maria and her servant jailer Jemima, which chronicle rape and other forms of abuse at the hands of men, shaped the creature's first-person narrative of abuse and his resultant sense of estrangement from the human species. So far, I have traced the development of two overlapping conceptions of AI that emerged out of the British Enlightenment to animate the monster's life and our sympathies towards his story at the heart of the novel Frankenstein. These two visions of AI are the surveillance machine and the humanoid automaton. These two visions of AI converge in Shelley's creature, who in fact became a literary model for AI. Shelley gave a signed copy of Frankenstein to her friend Lord Byron, who sponsored the dinner party at which she originally told the Gothic tale as part of a ghost story competition. Although we have no evidence that they met, Shelley probably influenced the literary imagination of Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, the first computer programmer. The biographer Miranda Seymour has shown that when Lovelace's colleague Charles Babbage invented the first computers in the 1820s and 1830s, these intelligent engines were compared to Frankenstein's monsters. The father of modern computer science, Alan Turing, cited the work of Lovelace and seemed to allude to the imagery of Frankenstein, or at least one of its 1930s Universal monster movie adaptations, in his 1948 paper on intelligent machinery. Turing cautioned that while it was possible to create AI that could immediately get up and walk on its own, the danger would be that without guidance, it could unwittingly rampage across the countryside, as it were, wreaking havoc in its wake. Turing argued that computer science should instead proceed with caution and build AIs in a more iterative, parental style, teaching the machinery how to operate on its own as one would a child over time. In this light, we can see that Wollstonecraft was the pivotal figure in the process of refracting ideas of AI from the British Enlightenment to Shelley, for she inspired in her daughter to see the dangers of bad and neglectful education for any artificially formed creature reliant on parental care and guidance to correctly process and ethically compute their lived experience of the world. Shelley then took prevailing ideas of artificial life and artificial intelligence in British Enlightenment political thought and transformed them into two dominant themes of modern political science fiction, especially for its dystopian strand concerned with bad governance and bad education. Before this talk began, you already knew what Mary Shelley is most famous for, her literary creation of the hulking 8-foot monster known as Frankenstein's creature. You might have also been familiar with one of the many pop cultural associations of the potential dangers of AI with Frankenstein's creature. This is a Guardian article from 2023, for example. What you might not have known is that Mary Shelley is also responsible for creating the archetypal image of the seemingly last human survivor of a man-made apocalyptic disaster. While a young grieving widow and single mother in her mid-20s, Shelley went on to publish in 1826 the first major modern post-apocalyptic pandemic novel about the near extinction of the human species, The Last Man. These overlapping phantasms of Frankenstein's creature, the last man, and the last woman have come to haunt Black and feminist, dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and political science fiction literature. Since the early 19th century, through their reception in literary, visual, and musical arts, these three images have transmogrified into the specter of the last woman. Shelley's many-layered gift to feminist thought is this marginalized, lonely, yet resilient, gender-hybrid figure who signifies the struggles of all vulnerable and oppressed people to realize justice in the wake of the threat of human-made or technologically exacerbated disasters, whether it be environmental crisis, catastrophic war, or AI-aided crime or exploitation. In early 1823, Shelley wrote an unfinished biography of her late husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and her life with him, which she described in her Journal of Sorrow as romantic beyond romance. She never published the biography due to an ongoing legal struggle with her aristocratic father-in-law over the use of the Shelley name in her publications. She did, however, go on to write The Last Man, which she originally subtitled A Romance. Rooted in Arthurian and court romance literature, her pandemic novel begins with the story of 5 interconnected love triangles tied to the English royal family at Windsor Castle in the 2070s. This romantic fantasy is a roman à clef that allegorizes her life with Percy and their circle of friends and artists in the second generation of British Romanticism. Even as her pandemic novel dramatizes both the beauties and the tragedies of her romantic life with Percy, The Last Man illustrates how plagues, both literal and figurative, spread due to the deprivation of the things that make life worth living, especially love. Shelley's speculative fiction about the near extinction of the human species trains the mind's eye to consider how the want of conditions for love brings to humanity the worst miseries it can suffer. The Last Man is a war and plague novel, partly based on Shelley's experience of the death of her friend Lord Byron from sepsis contracted on the battlefields of Greek independence. Byron's alter ego in the novel is Lord Raymond, whose philandering betrayal of both his wife and his lover leads him to abandon his political leadership of Republican Britain in the fight for Greek independence and die in the rubble of Constantinople. With Lord Raymond's tragic fate, Shelley suggests that interpersonal conflict causes the want of love, which in turn exacerbates other human wants, such as peace, health, happiness, and justice. Shelley thus gave a relational and emotional response to the problem of human strife that resonates with feminist political philosophy today. As the leading feminist theorist of gender, Judith Butler, has argued in the aftermath of COVID-19, quote, "A world in which such viral threat and destruction is possible raises the very question of life. What does it mean to live as a living creature, a creature among creatures, a life among living processes under conditions such as these?" Unquote. Shelley might have more pointedly asked, can life retain meaning at all when human strife drains it of love? The Last Man addresses this existential and political question with the symbolic rise of a plague during a war between Greece and Turkey in Constantinople in the year 2092. The Greeks' military strategy is to besiege their Turkish enemies behind the city walls during intolerable heat. It succeeds, but at the cost of causing famine, scarcity, and bad quality of food, suffering, waste and riot, the scourge of disease, and then a lethal epidemic that threatens to wipe out the human species. Akin to her 21st century eco-feminist successor and Afro-futurist science fiction and plague literature, Octavia Butler, Shelley grasped that humans and their technology can undo shape and potentially destroy the whole environment through artifice. Even disasters that appeared wholly natural, such as extreme weather, were artificially made more miserable and deadly by human intervention and conflict. Between September of 1822 and the end of 1825, when she conceived, composed, and proofed her plague novel, Shelley consistently rooted the concept for The Last Man in her personal manuscripts and her memories of the lives and deaths of Percy Bysshe Shelley, their children, and Lord Byron. She did not want posterity to miss that she, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, was not merely the author, but the living mind from whence the unprecedented plot had been drawn. When she wrote the quasi-autobiographical preface for the novel, she had the unnamed woman narrator relate in her first-person voice how she discovered and reassembled the fragments of a prophecy found in a cave near Naples on the 8th of December, 1818. This prophecy, she implies, is the story of the last man who survives a near extinction event for the human species in the late 21st century. Although the prophecy of the last man at the core of her pandemic novel is fictional, Shelley had in fact visited the cave of the ancient Sibyl of Baiae on the 8th of December, 1818, with Percy and her stepsister Claire. She recorded this journey in her second journal book, less than 2 months after the death of her second infant daughter, Clara. By rooting her pandemic novel's title and preface in her private manuscripts and journals of misfortune and sorrow, Shelley left open the possibility of interpreting the narrator of her global plague tragedy on 2 levels at once. And as an historical woman, the famous author Mary Shelley, as well as her fictional male avatar, the self-described last man and narrator of the novel, Lionel Verney. Soon after the 1826 publication of her allegorical plague novel, Shelley's post-apocalyptic figure of the last man became associated with her own notoriously tragic life story, especially her youthful losses of family, friends, and literary collaborators. Her idea of the last man almost immediately transformed into the idea of the last woman in popular media of the period. Just a month after The Last Man's publication in January 1826, a reviewer cruelly asked why the author, who had outlived her husband, did not simply call her novel and herself The Last Woman. In May 1826, the Glasgow-based satirical cartoonist William Heath issued an intentionally offensive depiction of the last woman as a black woman slave. The first known work of visual art based on Shelley's The Last Man, pictured here, employed the novel's post-apocalyptic setting to make an overtly racist and misogynistic point. If an international war or other global disaster wiped out all but one woman, men of all nations and races would fight to the death to possess her, no matter if she were an African slave. Heath could be read as mocking men as much as women, and whites as much as people of color, but either way, the artist crudely exploited gender and race stereotypes perpetuated by British imperial politics of the Georgian era. In the editorial commentary on the cartoon, emphatically titled The Last Woman, the artist drew a telling parallel between the black woman and the widowed author of The Last Man. Heath wanted to draw the likeness of the all-engrossing Mrs. Shelley, perhaps to hint at her unorthodox past among the poetic and atheistic lords of creation of British Romanticism, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. But he refrained from directly caricaturing Shelley because it would have caused a row. Instead, he depicted the absolutely final woman on earth as one who would otherwise be the last to go off the marriage market. The commentary salaciously implied that the reverse was true in the case of Mrs. S, for she was early to go on the market when she eloped with a married man at age 16. In Heath's satirical cartoon of Shelley's The Last Man, the double-edged quality of the humor meant that women, especially black women, got the last laugh. The image suggested that in some future anarchistic state of war, like Shelley's 21st century plague novel, men would fight to the death over women, leaving a single black woman to survive, to potentially start life anew on the planet. In an ironic reversal, she would be alone and freed from the twin chains of patriarchy and slavery. If she had seen Heath's caricature, Shelley might have smirked, for she had written a story that was already widely recognized as an allegory for the rising struggle against chattel slavery. In March 1824, she wrote a letter to her friend Edward Trelawney and remarked that she was pleased that the Foreign Secretary George Canning paid a compliment to Frankenstein as the British Parliament debated legislation for the amelioration of the state of the slaves in some portions of the West Indies. In this way, Mary Shelley's dystopian novels, Frankenstein and The Last Man, carried forward an abolitionist tradition rooted in her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft's work, whose anti-slavery arguments were printed in a Jamaican newspaper in the run-up to the massive slave rebellion of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. 35 years later, Shelley may have felt like the last woman, but she was never truly alone. For she was a vital part of an international tradition of utopian feminist abolitionist thought dating back to her mother's generation in the era of the French and Haitian revolutions. In an ironic coincidence, in Heath's dystopian cartoon of The Last Woman, the hidden and likely unintended utopia is not so different than the operatic ending of Shelley's pandemic novel. For Lionel Verney, the male avatar for the female author is the last to go off in search of other survivors with whom to remake the human condition and hopefully restore peace and justice on Earth. As the female author behind this hopeful figure of the last man, Shelley played the parallel role of a real-world survivor in search of social justice on a global scale. The leading Black woman author in 20th century and early 21st century science fiction, Octavia Butler, was a reader of Mary Shelley, who often paid homage to Frankenstein in her award-winning novels and short stories. Butler's Parable series, published in the 1990s, also made explicit the feminist and anti-racist point of the post-apocalyptic plotline of The Last Man. Butler envisioned a teenage girl survivor, Lauren Olamina, leading the way out of the crime and plague-ridden, burning city of Los Angeles into a brighter post-apocalyptic future on the anarchistic frontier of Northern California in the early 2020s. This last, or rather lasting, woman was a Black woman who had endured everything in order to lead others to justice. Octavia Butler's image of the last woman as the independent woman in search of justice for herself and others resonates with the cosmopolitan, anti-war, and human rights themes of Shelley's Frankenstein and The Last Man. Butler's prescient concerns with the environmental crisis and the power of technology to be used to either exacerbate or address the human-made emergency echo the themes of Frankenstein and The Last Man, but also resonate with tech issues today. Butler and other Shelleyan writers of science fiction lead us to return again and again to a series of 4 philosophical questions about our obligations towards the creations we make. What are human responsibilities, individually and collectively, towards scientific and technological creations that seem to be as smart or smarter than we are? Do we have duties to care for and protect our technological creations if they scare us or even seem monstrous with their sheer power or intelligence? How can we overcome or avoid unintended or potential disasters of our own cultural design without losing sight of the central place of technology in our very humanity? While there are ongoing waves of panic about the rise of a form of AI superintelligence that could control or even destroy humankind like a fleet of Frankenstein's monsters, these fears have typically fallen flat or been proven false when soberly analyzed. The real dangers of AI-equipped computers and other digitized technologies are more likely to be the energy crisis, propelled by the servers that fuel new AI technologies such as ChatGPT. Surveillance, fake news, and identity theft technologies aided by AI are likely to continue to destabilize democracies and delegitimate elections around the world, as they have done in my country, the United States of America, since Trump's successful campaign for the presidency in 2016. Generative AI has the very real power to digitally exploit the bodies of women and children for pornography distributed without consent across cultural and national borders through the public internet or the dark web. Even one of the most powerful women in the world, the billionaire singer-songwriter Taylor Swift, has been subject to digitized abuse and appropriation of her identity through the dissemination of AI-created sexually violent pornography based on her image. If one of the most rich and privileged white women ever to live on the planet can become victim to such AI-based exploitation and crime, then all of us are vulnerable. Internationally recognized for her storytelling abilities through song, Swift regularly alludes to Mary Shelley and her circle of Romantic era writers in her lyrics. Swift used the image of the last woman who endures social disaster to achieve personal vindication in her 2020 pandemic ballad, The Last Great American Dynasty, and compared herself to the monster on the hill in her 2022 Gothic anthem, Anti-Hero, an overt homage to Shelley, Byron, and Boris Karloff's filmic version of The Creature. Like Butler's science fiction, Swift's lyrics call us to consider the ways that Mary Shelley's prescient political and moral thought on technology, human rights, and global justice might aid us in our ongoing struggles with the power of human artifice and the products of our collective intelligence to help or harm the world at large. Likewise, I hope that you and other feminist thinkers worldwide will continue to use the power of the mind and the imagination to make connections between the futuristic work of Mary Shelley and our contemporary struggles with AI and other digital technologies. Thank you for listening, and I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That is a fascinating weave across centuries and forms of fiction and music and technology. But I could go on, I won't. It's 10 o'clock. We are going to finish at 10:15 because we have to. So we have 15 minutes. Obviously, we have 15 minutes for questions here. Obviously, discussions can happen afterwards. But I am just going to open the floor now for questions, and maybe take 3 or so at a time. Charmaine, yeah. And then person at the back. Yes, you. Yeah, so Charmaine, yeah.
Hello, and thank you for your talk, for your keynote, Eileen. Listening to you early on in your presentation, you make the statement, we are all artificially formed creatures, in the sense that this is what Mary Shelley's work leads you to conclude. And I'm wondering if you could give us your reflections on who are the we and what you mean by artificial. And the second question I had was that Mary Shelley's work leads you to reflect on what are our ethical duties towards the creations we make. In other words, towards Frankenstein. And I do have to say that listening to you, to your choice of Frankenstein as the focus, paralleling this tendency to portray in popular culture AI as a spectacular external creature that will produce all sorts of disasters. I wondered why you felt the ethical emphasis should be on the creations that are made as opposed to the use of those creations by the makers. If we are using, or if you are using Frankenstein as a way of thinking through our everyday realities, where, as you did point out towards the end, I was waiting for that actually, that the more pernicious uses of AI are actually more everyday and hidden, and where one would think that the ethical questions raised would be, well, why is racial profiling so common, or why is it used in criminalizing certain parts of the population that in other instances are just aggregated as we, but in practice are not, because they are them and there are the creators. Thank you.
Okay, yes, you.
Bom dia, meu nome é Adélio. Não vou necessariamente fazer uma pergunta, mas um comentário. Primeiro de tudo, queria dizer que estou muito feliz pela linha ilustrativa que usou para apresentar a lógica de criação e desenvolvimento da inteligência artificial e, igualmente, a nossa responsabilidade sobre ela. Tinha a impressão de estar a ver na prática como é que funcionam as inteligências artificiais generativas, à medida que ia ilustrando isto. É um tema que a mim interessa bastante, de modo que estaria até muito feliz de ter acesso a esta apresentação. Igual a Frankenstein, eu olho também para uma outra personagem importante na infância de quase todos nós aqui, que é a figura de Pinóquio, do velho Geppetto. É um objeto de madeira que ganhou até poderes de fala e uma consciência, embora fosse algo anexo, não diretamente ligado, que com o tempo começou a sentir-se livre de experimentar coisas e seus próprios caminhos. E isso trouxe ao seu criador muita tristeza pelas consequências das ações que esta criação tomou. Estas histórias todas me fazem pensar que provavelmente o mal não seja essencialmente a criação. Isso é natural do ser humano, criar. Mas na forma como criamos um espaço para que essas criações se sintam parte importante das nossas vidas, mas não autônomas o suficiente para que elas se sintam capazes de inverter as posições, isto é, de criação para dominador do seu criador. É importante, no meio disto tudo, nos mantermos vigilantes e claros sobre o que realmente queremos que a inteligência artificial seja ou faça por nós. E mais do que ter clareza sobre isso, é respeitar os limites dos objetivos que nós traçamos sobre essas tecnologias, sobre o risco de perdermos o controle das coisas. Muito obrigado.
Can I just say from online, someone is asking the English interpreter to move the mic closer to them because they can't quite hear the translation online. And I think there was a question from someone online. Tigist?
Hello. Hi. I think in many ways, Charmaine's questions might be addressing it, but I was hitting with one very basic question. It might be very not useful, but I just wanted to ask it, like, why is Mary Shelley's book or reflection of her or whatever the presentation was is so important in our context, specifically in the context of the conference, but also the place we are living in at the moment in the African continent? How is that? Like, that link was not made clear.
Hello, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. Okay, I'll start with Charmaine's excellent question. She asked, what do I mean by the we? And what do I mean by the word artificial when I say, in the spirit of Mary Shelley's work, we are all artificial creatures, artificially shaped and made by our social, cultural, educational environment. By the we, I follow Shelley in meaning human beings, humanity. And obviously humanity is diverse across cultures, nations, languages, and so on. And Mary Shelley recognized that. I tried to highlight that in my talk, just how international a writer Mary Shelley was, how she, her global plague novel, The Last Man, for example, is literally set around the world and engages multiple cultures and multiple literary traditions. She was actually very well versed in Portuguese literature, for example. And so the we means humanity as it exists on planet Earth. In this way, she's a bit like contemporary writers of science fiction who acknowledge the possibility of other life forms, perhaps on other planets and other dimensions. But when they talk about human beings, they usually talk about them as from Earth or having traveled from Earth to other planets. Like Octavia Butler often represents in her Afrofuturist science fiction, right? So the we means humanity. Artificial, what does that mean? So I think Mary Shelley was really prescient in getting us to think, getting us, her readers, to think about human nature differently than it had traditionally been understood. So I think there was a tendency going up to her time to think of human nature as something fixed and biological. Something fixed and biological, immutable, unchanging. Mary Shelley, I think, anticipates modern social science in particular, also gender studies, in seeing that humanity is always shifting and changing through its interaction with the wider social and cultural environment. We are products of our own artifice or technology, and technology for Mary Shelley begins with the power of the pen, the power of writing itself, the power of language, and how we express it through art, how we express it through writing. And so artificial, to me, does not mean fake. Artificial does not mean unreal. Artificial means from art, from techne, going back to the ancient Greek, which Mary Shelley herself studied from the age of 16. The idea that human beings are defined in some sense by their power to use technology, as simple as the pen, to create and interact with the world, reshape it in their own image, and shape one another through that process of building culture and art over time. To me, artificial has much more to do with art than anything else. And in there, I follow Mary Shelley's work. And so in other words, I don't think we have anything to be afraid of being artificial creatures. I think it's a concept we should embrace. I think Mary Shelley wanted us to embrace the idea that being artificially shaped was just part of what it meant to be human, and that we should accept that fact and work with it and direct it towards the best ends in life, which for her were love and justice for everyone, for all beings. She also had a remarkable sympathy for non-human life forms. And if you read The Last Man, which I hope you all will do, you will see Mary Shelley has this wonderful reverence for nature and for all forms of life within nature. And I think that's rooted in her religious outlook, which as I noted, was unorthodox. And yet it gave her this spiritual outlook on the importance of having a mindset of stewardship and care and even love towards the whole world as it is created. You asked, why use this image of the creature or creation when talking about AI, especially when AI is basically invisible to us? It's basically invisible. Well, this is one reason why I wanted to follow Shelley and demarcating two visions of the so-called human monster, the automaton, the humanoid automaton, and the surveillance machine. The surveillance machine is the invisible side. And that's really more the way we experience it now, and I predict we will continue to experience it. I think the idea of the humanoid automaton, which we might experience in film through the image of Frankenstein's creature or Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator, those kinds of AI equipped robots, will probably be part of our future. Hopefully not as kind of hulking and violent as Schwarzenegger's version, but we will more likely be engaging with the invisible forms of AI through surveillance technologies. But I wanted to play with that dual-sided character of AI. It's both something we can see sometimes, and other times it's invisible to us. You asked about use of AI, and it's true. In my talk, I emphasized a rhetoric of care. And the reason I did that was twofold. One is I think part of the danger of contemporary AI ethics is its emphasis on instrumentality and use versus attentiveness, care, education, ethical regard for the other. And so one thing I think Mary Shelley did so beautifully in Frankenstein is conceive our ethical obligation to not just confront the other, but to truly sympathize with the other. And this is what she calls us to do, I believe, in the figure of the creature. And if we read the creature as a prototype of AI, I think Mary Shelley is calling us not to think of AI as that monstrous other that we kind of fear and run away from, like Victor Frankenstein, but rather as a potential relationship, an ethical relationship we have to engage in, to provide care, sustenance, protection, education, programming, nurturance, so that AI acts or behaves in ways that are considered ethical and appropriate for our conceptions of justice going forward. I wanted to address the wonderful question in Portuguese about AI, Pinocchio, and Frankenstein. That's a wonderful comparison. I am certain Mary Shelley knew of the Pinocchio story. She was deeply read in Italian literature. And but thank you for reminding me that I should pursue that comparison. Now, I do know that contemporary Mexican director Del Toro is a huge fan of both Frankenstein and Pinocchio. He's already produced an animated film about Pinocchio for Netflix, and he's going to produce one on Frankenstein coming very soon. And he clearly sees that connection between the Pinocchio story and the Frankenstein story. And I'm guessing Mary Shelley saw it too. So thank you for raising that wonderful comment. And I will share my work with you. Just come up and talk to me afterwards. The final question, fantastic question from our online listeners. Thank you so much for being here. Why is Frankenstein important in our moment? It's a great question. I mean, I'm a historian. I love to study the past. And, my purpose in life as a scholar is to make the past relevant to the present. So thank you for this question. This is what my mentor in grad school, Ian Shapiro, would call the so what question. Why does it matter? Well, I mean, I think Frankenstein matters right now for AI ethics and AI politics because you can see how the image is used in our popular media. Whether it's that Guardian article I put up on the screen, which uses the image from the 1931 film starring Boris Karloff to represent the confrontation between the AI programmer and his creation, that confrontational image of our relationship with AI. That's one way in which it's used. And then in film, I mentioned Schwarzenegger and Terminator. That's probably the most kind of distorted image of Frankenstein's creature ever created, and yet it is the most influential. And I would say what we need to do is actually combat these stereotyped images of Frankenstein's creature / AI as a monster. And we need to unpack those images, criticize them as feminists, show why it's wrong to always make the assumption the other is a monster and must be defeated or fought. And instead think, well, what if we thought of the other, whether that's, another person or a computer, what if we thought of the other as more like a child that needed care, respect, love in order to be a fully fledged cooperative member of our culture and society. So that is my my plea, in that in AI ethics, as feminist theorists, we try to adopt the model of both Mary Shelley and Alan Turing in thinking of AI along the lines of a quote child machine, which is Alan Turing's language from his 1948 paper on intelligent machinery. If we treat the computer or the AI like a child machine, and we train it over time like we would a child to learn ethics and learn how to interact with the world in a socially cooperative way, we'll have better outcomes, and we will be less scared of our own technologies. Thank you very much.
Okay, we are going to be at the end here, so wait a second, wait a second. I just want to say I'm really sorry that we do have to finish now, and I'm sure there'll be conversations in the next round table. But yes, thank you very much.
Recording stopped.
We should be to time now, so coffee break is 10:15 to 10:45, and the round table starts in here at 10:45.
Unfortunately, I couldn't join you in person because of travel commitments. So I've recorded these 15-minute remarks in advance. I hope that we can Good afternoon, everyone. A big thanks to Marcia and Shine and the rest of the organizing team for the invitation. I'm really excited to be in discussion with the folks on this panel. I'm calling in from Nairobi. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you in person because of travel commitments. So I've recorded these 15-minute remarks in advance. I hope that we can follow along clearly without any internet interference. And I am here in person, so I'm looking forward to participating live during the Q&A. Today, I want to dive into a very specific example of what has become arguably the most ubiquitous piece of knowledge infrastructure, the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI, as a point of entry to explore the infrastructuring of hegemonic power
Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone. We are going to really start in a minute. Asanda, do you think we can try to get more people coming back in? Thank you. No, herding is like pushing, cats don't like to be pushed. So, yeah, herding cats. It's impossible. You've never heard of that before. It's not in Portuguese. If they're familiar. Oh, herding chickens. Okay, that makes sense. It's the same problem. For the English speakers in the room, we will need the machine. Thank you so much for returning to the room in a really timely manner. Really appreciate that we are keeping to time. And I'm looking at Sandra's beautiful face, smiling, because that is the main job that we have been tasked with today as the chairs. So thank you everyone for joining. This is the roundtable discussion on the same theme on feminist knowledge. And we will just start. We'll jump right in. And what I'll do is introduce the speakers. And then to leave plenty of time after the prepared presentations for discussion and questions that emerged in the earlier session, as well as in the previous sessions in the previous days. So really looking forward to the conversation. So the prepared part of our presentations will be 15 to 20 minutes max. Unfortunately, Jane Bannett, who appears in the program, couldn't join us at the last minute. But so we do have a bit more time than we initially thought. So just wanted to kind of just start with introducing the speakers before we start, and I'll introduce them in the order of their presentations. But before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge one of the questions that Jane had sent through prior to her change of circumstances where really unfortunately she couldn't join us. For those of you who don't know Jane, she is part of the founding member of Feminist Africa. And the question that she asked and what her provocation was going to be on this roundtable was this question: how feminists based on the continent might trouble the debates on digitization, polarized as they often are between predictions of doom and adulations about new possibilities in quotation mark. And I was looking forward to reading her profile, her bio, where it ends with how she is old enough to know better and still young enough to begin again every day. So if you need that sort of line of thinking and questioning, that is in the room. I hope someone picks it up as we move on in the conversation. Then let me introduce Professor Sia Kibona-Clark, who will be talking about the algorithmic resistance. So addressing algorithmic representational harm against African women. Sia is an associate professor in the African Studies Department at Howard University. For those of you who don't know, it's a HBCU university, which is quite, I think, significant, and you will probably see that in the way she thinks and talks. So the feminist conversation that comes out of that space. So her research explores themes such as hip hop in Africa, African feminism, and the influence of social movements on culture production. Sia's various publications not only shed light on rich and diverse African hip hop communities, but also address critical social issues. Her recent book, African Women in Digital Spaces, explores the use of social media for advocacy by women across Africa and the diaspora. In addition to her academic pursuits, she has curated exhibitions on African culture and photography and is the host of the Hip Hop African podcast. Katja Chavel will be talking about decolonizing theories and concepts in the search for equity and women's participation in the digital age, with a focus on her work that she does here in Mozambique. And I think important to remember here is, thinking a little bit about how cases and situations from which we do our research and our work is also feminist theorizing. So one of the things to kind of think about maybe is the way we listen to different situations might have to change, or we might need to develop some capacities around that. So really looking forward to learning more about her work. Katja is an anthropologist. She has her degree from Eduardo Mondlane University here in Mozambique, is member of the Bioethic Committee in Health, and researcher at Center for Research and Technology Transfer for Community Development in the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Higher Education. She provides technical advice for dissemination and adoption of technologies and innovations by the communities, and also identifies entry points to ensure that these interventions adequately address the needs of vulnerable people. As a researcher, she facilitated engagement of government institutions, women, activists, and NGO to further gender sensitivity and responsiveness of the recovery and reconstruction. She also provides advice for addressing gaps in relation to gender on digital inclusion process. And finally, we have online Dr. Angela Akune, who has studied and worked on open science and knowledge infrastructures for the last 14 years with a keen interest in addressing global inequities in science and technology. She currently leads a portfolio of programs at Code for Science and Society, including community-centered grant making, cohort training programs, and research initiatives. Trained as a social scientist of science, Angela received her doctorate in anthropology from the University of California, Irvine. Angela's approach to science and tech praxis is grounded in 5 years of formative experiences, co-founding the research department at Nairobi's first innovation hub for the tech community. And Angela will be speaking on demystifying the digital object identifier, DOI. For the academics in the room, we're quite familiar with that acronym, and the implications for African knowledge infrastructure. So without further ado, I'll just pass on the mic to Sia.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I want to preface the presentation by saying my work focuses mostly on African women in popular culture and looking at representations of us, but also representations that we create to counter the narrative that's out there. So I've increasingly had to contend with the algorithm and how the algorithm impacts how we interact online, but also AI. So just kind of as a side note for the presentation, all of the images are created by AI. So, you know, I've been learning how prompts impact what you receive. So whether it be images or whether it be text. So I just kind of wanted to start off by saying that. And am I not? Do I need? Ah. Is it there? Where am I pointing? Oh, shit, wait. All right. So looking at the emergence of social media, you know, social media has increasingly taken over our lives. You know, when we look at just the timeline, we have Google being founded in 1998, before smartphones, before social media. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, now X in the early 21st century. Then we have smartphone apps coming in 2008, Instagram and TikTok. So all of these apps are increasingly relevant. They're spaces in which we negotiate. For Google, it is often the primary source of information. I think all of us go there on a regular basis to search all kinds of things. And so, all right. As African women period, but specifically African women are negotiating online spaces, there are a lot of issues that they're having to contend with. One is African women are more likely to see normalized images of sexual violence carried out against them. And I'm going to talk about the adult film industry. They're more likely to be harassed or targeted for abuse online. And in a survey, they found a third of the African women who are online experienced online gender-based violence. And so when we look at the algorithm, we see the production of a lot of misogynoir, which is a term coined by Moya Bailey, which speaks to really the hatred of Black women, women of African descent, and it's the distinct way in which we are often targeted. And so misogynoir in search algorithms often have produced pornographic and racist images of women in Africa and the diaspora. Now, I will say that a lot of work and pushback has been done, because initially there was a time when you put Black girls in Google, and on the front page, you were more likely to get pornographic images and racist images. Same thing with Asian women, Latina women. So these were kind of the predominant images and sites that came up. Luckily, you know, one of the things through a lot of effort, a lot of that has been rectified in a way. There's still some problematic images that come up, but when we look at the adult film industry, specifically when, and as accessible as adult films are, they're on our phones, they're everywhere, the depiction of African women, specifically in adult films, is problematic. When you look at Black women, you often have very disturbing names and titles of videos, but when that woman is specifically identified as African, one of the predominant themes or scenes is younger African women with older white men, and it's kind of this colonizer fantasy, which is very disturbing. So those videos predominate the adult film industry when we're looking at African women. And so when we look at the algorithm, again, you know, my area is looking at popular culture, so I've had to really, you know, do some background research on the algorithm. But the algorithm was created by people, and it's engineered to classify social identities, and they're informed by the creator's own beliefs and what those identities are. So users' behaviors on apps do influence what we receive. So, for example, I don't routinely see anything pro Donald Trump. I don't see anything that is overtly racist in my feed because the algorithm has learned I don't want to see that. And if I see it, I'm more likely to get off of that app, so it just feeds me things that reinforce. So in my world, we're all feminists and we're all wonderful, we're all Pan-Africanists because that is what is in my feed because the algorithm has learned that's what I want to see. Now, the interesting thing is, as many of us are facing online harassment, it is individuals who are not pro-women but anti-women, but are intentionally following feminist activists online for the express purpose of trolling them and harassing them. So it's a very interesting thing. You have to go out of your way to actually find those pages. So in trying to push back, a lot of women online have had to contend with shadow banning. I know we've talked about that. Some other presenters have talked about it. So I went to AI and I asked it, what is the shadow banning of Black women on social media? And it came up with actually some pretty good responses. Shadow banning deals with the censorship of activism. Many of us often use social media to advocate for social justice. So this can be seen as threatening by the platform's algorithms, leading to increased scrutiny and potential shadow bans. Harassment and reporting rates. We are reported more frequently for our content, which can trigger shadow banning policies, even if the reports are unfounded. So if multiple accounts report you, the platforms, Instagram, X, will remove your account or shut down your account without, there's no kind of investigation, and it's very difficult to get your account back. So if you're someone who has amassed a lot of followers and you have a strong voice in the platform, it doesn't take much to get your account shut down. And so we had a case, Women for Change, which is a South African feminist group, had their hashtag Men Are Trash shadow banned. And, you know, there was a lot of conversation on why using that hashtag, and so that's, you know, kind of a different conversation, but just the issue, they were using it in the form of activism, in the form of social commentary, but I would guess men were offended and complained, and therefore the hashtag was shadow banned. Cultural misunderstandings. AI tells us that there is often misinterpretation of our cultural references or humor specific to Black communities, which can lead to false flagging of content, resulting in visibility restrictions. You also have the male gaze, which will not be ignored. So often community standards are enforced differently if you're a high-profile man or trying to get the attention of men. If you're not appealing to the male gaze, you are not rewarded on the platform. One of the examples, there's a musician, up-and-coming rap artist named Doechii. Her first video was a song called Crazy, in which she actually is critical of body imaging. She's critical of like body shaming and all of these things. And so there is nudity, simulated nudity, and the video was shadow banned, even though there are videos that are far more explicit, but those other videos tend to service the male gaze versus challenging the male gaze. And so that was another interesting example of the ways in which our content is often taken down. Digital blackface and blackfishing are two terms that have also emerged. Blackfishing is a term that was coined in 2018 by Ayanna Thompson. Digital blackface is the memification of Black users. Non-Black users pretend to be Black and take on their emotion expression in posted videos, images, or GIFs. Now, one of the things I will say is men who game online have confronted this quite a bit. Oftentimes, non-Black users will assume Black avatars and use kind of, the N-word and very kind of exaggerated, stereotypical behavior while they're in online gaming communities. And it's something that really, I don't know, they haven't been able to figure out how to stop, but it's something that many of my male students who game kind of talk about that happening. Blackfishing is when non-Black women who have cosmetic alterations or edit their photos in ways that present themselves as less European looking, racially ambiguous, or of mixed ancestry, and again, are often acting in ways online that they perceive to be ethnic, Black, African, and it is, again, one of those things that we're often having to contend with. And, we could talk about some of the very famous women who online, and, when they're tired of it, I think Miley Cyrus was one who a while ago went through a phase where she was very ethnic, and then she decided, nope, she's tired of that. She wants to kind of, shed that. So that is often another thing that we're continuing with. Right, it was working, and then I don't know if it's the battery. So I am going to talk about TikTok. Did somebody move? Did somebody stand in front of the? Okay, there we go. So TikTok was formed in 2017, and it has quickly become one of the most important sites, apps for influencers specifically. TikTok's For Your page, which is when you open TikTok, you automatically start seeing videos. And it's been called one of the most addictive scrolling experiences on the internet. Now, TikTok has over 1 billion users. TikTok's top 20 users have between 53 and 156 million followers. Only 3 of them are Black. Number 1, I still don't understand. The brother he doesn't talk, and I don't get it, but he's number 1. You also have the other 2, Will Smith and Jason Derulo, who are celebrities. None of them are Black women. Now, this is, even though much of the content created by Black women are used by non-Black influencers to get likes, to get attention, to get followers, we still have this issue. So the algorithm privileges white heteronormative content. And what does that mean, and why is that important? Because visibility is currency. Influencers can earn a lot. I mean, if you've got, less than 10,000, you can maybe get $5 to $10 per post. But when you're talking about 500,000, 1 million followers, you're getting $400 to $600 per post. More than 1 million followers, you can earn over $1,000 per post. So we're talking about real money. So it's not just, oh, you're more popular than I. It's you are actually using my content to make money and not citing me. And so you have that issue. You also have the issue of content users who are not in Western nations being able to actually set up ways that they can actually get paid for their content. So that's also another issue. But when you start looking at the way content is taken and not properly cited, you have, forms of resistance. And so many ways, non-white users, queer users, people who are undocumented, people who are political, people who are differently abled, poor, body shaming, all of these things these voices are often sidelined and marginalized. And so to resist the algorithm, many online social media users have been able to avoid content moderation algorithms that suppress certain messages by using coded language. Sometimes when you're talking about, like now, Palestine, you may see someone like putting dashes in between some of the letters or spelling it differently to try to trick the algorithm so that your post will become visible. I know in looking up some protests that were happening in Washington, D.C., wanting to see kind of what was happening, I was unable to find, I knew the videos existed, but was unable to find many videos because many of them were hidden and shadow banned. Sharing strategies and tips in private chat groups. There are pods, these things called pods, which I'm not a part of any of them, but I've heard about them. And there are ways that users support each other's posts. So if you belong to a pod that has several thousand members, you all agree to go and like someone's post, and that will then get that person's post more visible, because the algorithm will think, this is important, I'm going to elevate this and make this more visible in other people's feeds. So it's an act of resistance to the algorithmic governance, but it also is a way that people are building community. I will say many of these tactics are temporary because the algorithm often adjusts. The algorithm is constantly shifting and adjusting. Perhaps in the earlier days of, online protests regarding Gaza, you were more likely to see content. Now the algorithm has adjusted and has, recognized certain terms, so you have to now be a little bit more creative with the way that you put your content. Also, the algorithms prefer videos to text. So if you're on X and you're just, having text, it is less likely to show up in feeds than if you include video content. So many users are figuring this out. And as a Gen Xer, I will say my students, Gen Z has really been able to learn and master how to kind of circumvent these things. So there are a couple really interesting examples of activists fooling the algorithm. One was in 2020 when White Lives Matter began to trend on social media. K-pop fans hijacked the hashtag. So when you went to look up White Lives Matter, there were all these K-pop videos. And so it essentially drowned out all of the racism that was intended when, other users started using hashtag White Lives Matter. During the same time, K-pop fans, specifically of the group BTS, raised over $1 million for the movement for Black Lives. So this is an example of, one, allyship, which I think is really, really important, but also the way, folks went online and said, you know what, we're going to push back. And then you have another example, 2021, where there was a strike, a Black TikTok strike. You had dancers so often when an artist releases a song, dancers will create a dance, the dance will go viral. Well, what was happening is non-Black TikTok users were taking those dances, they had more followers, and so there would be a time when you would look up, you would hear a certain song or dance that had been created, and it may take a while to actually get to the original person who created it. And so they decided, okay, you know what, for this period of time, we're not going to create any new dances to videos. And so I believe it was Megan Thee Stallion who released a song. They didn't do any dances. But what they did start doing is sharing the videos of TikTok users who did create dances. And they just really weren't as creative or good. And so then it became an example of, this is what happens when we stop submitting content and how important our content is, but also you need to cite us. You need to, make sure that our videos are prominent, because again, visibility is currency. Now, the use of the hashtag has also kind of become significant for a lot of activists online. And the hashtag gathers and catalogs topics, and it's a quick and efficient way to share information. It informs online and in-person campaigns. So this was the March to Parliament. This was actually recently posted July 2025, so that was a couple days ago. And again, you're using the hashtag March to Parliament, so when you click on that hashtag, you then see other actions, other commentary, other posts that people are putting out there to let people know what's happening in Uganda and what's happening in Kenya and other places where there are currently protests and resistance happening. Another one is, you see a lot of these posts that have different purposes. Some are calls for action, some are calls for answers, some are status updates, and some are protest statements. So recently there was a protest that happened yesterday in Kenya, and on X it was posted. Some of the main organizers and activists participating were tagged in the post, and so if you're going online, this is a way to find out if I'm in Nairobi, what's happening, where do I go, how do I get there. Now, mind you, a lot of this is also being shared in WhatsApp groups, which is, you know, a very popular way of spreading information really fast. But social media has also, you know, remains a important tool for activists, even though the algorithm is still there. Many people finding ways, and especially if you're just starting this protest or what have you, it sometimes takes the algorithm a bit of time to catch up. And so you have many African feminists online who have posted and used X or Instagram to speak out. So you have Rosebell Kagomide, who runs AfricanFeminism.com, who says those in social justice circles must not be allowed to do as they please with our lives. So she's been very critical of many of the anti-LGBTQ legislation in Uganda. So there are the African Women in Development had tweeted, I don't know what it's called now, but we should not have to sacrifice our identities and communities in order to exist. So these are statements that are being put out. These are ways in which African feminists are able to organize. So if something is happening like now in Nairobi, I know who to follow online. If you're in these networks, you know where to go to get legitimate information, to find out how you can contribute during NSARS. Nigerian feminists were really organized in creating ways that you could donate to the NSARS movement. And so it is, while there are problems on social media, the algorithm is there to prevent a lot. We are still using it in very important ways. And there are plenty of hashtags that have been created by African feminists, used by African feminists, from Say Her Name, being female in Nigeria, Men Are Trash, You OK Sis, which came about as a way for basically for Black women to check in on each other. We know Me Too was actually created by a Black woman. Just Do It for Castor was around Castor Semenya, the things that she was going through. So you had the total shutdown, which was South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda. I believe all three had used that hashtag at different points. I think it was 2019, I think, was when, this is right before COVID, that you had the simultaneous marches in South Africa. So you, again, Stop Racism at Pretoria Girls High. These are ways that we are able to communicate with each other. Now, again, sometimes these hashtags get hijacked for bad, sometimes for good, like with the case of White Lives Matter, but sometimes you go and rather than finding, if you say, you know, look up Free Stella Nyanzi, instead of getting more information and updates when she was being detained, you may get things that are actually attacking her. Things that are actually anti-women. So that's, you know, one of the things that happen, but often you will find that these hashtags and the ways in which we're able to interact online, and the ways in which we are able to constantly challenge the algorithm, constantly challenge these spaces. When Twitter was bought and, you know, became X, we were really, really aware of the fact that these platforms are not ours. They don't belong to us. And if Elon Musk says, I'm done, I'm tired, I'm bored, I'm shutting it down, it will impact not only Black women, African women, but activists all over the world. So it is very precarious. I know people have been looking for alternatives. Those alternatives are also owned by other people, or specifically privately owned. But even, you know, that whole issue of ownership, private versus government, like which government? Like, you know, so it's a very precarious situation, but we have been creative in finding ways to circumvent it and finding ways to actually use it to our advantage. And I believe that is it. I'm done.
I love, I mean, your point about, you know, if you're part of a network, then you know who to follow. That's precisely the conversation, for example, in indigenous circles, right? About like indigenous knowledge production is not actually, studies is not actually about production of knowledge, but learning the skills to read the right signposts, right? And being visible to a very particular kind to each other, right? So I think that's really an interesting way to think about knowledge. Next, we have. She will be speaking in Portuguese. So please use your headsets if you are limited in your language skills in English.
Bom dia, mais uma vez. E let me wait. 1 minute. Okay, that's fine. Ok. Bom dia. Primeiro gostava de agradecer pelo convite para compartilhar experiências, expectativas, para sonhar e projetar possibilidades de futuros digitais, como a Shine esteve aqui a sugerir no início da apresentação do painel. Eu já tinha sido apresentada pela Shine, mas acho que gostava de repisar 2 aspectos. Eu sou antropóloga e investigadora no Centro de Investigação e Transferência de Tecnologias para o Desenvolvimento Comunitário, uma instituição tutelada pelo Ministro da Ciência e Tecnologia, que é responsável por assegurar a transferência de tecnologia para as comunidades, é também responsável por fazer a disseminação de tecnologias alternativas úteis para o desenvolvimento comunitário, quer no meio rural, como também no meio urbano. E este processo de transferência de tecnologias é feito de várias formas, dentre as quais publicações, seminários, capacitações para literacia digital, não só para mulheres adultas, mas também para jovens, no âmbito do processo de inclusão digital nas comunidades. Então, a pessoa que fala aqui não é a investigadora do CITT, mas a antropóloga, porque são duas personalidades algumas vezes conflitantes que existem, sendo antropóloga e investigadora, embora as duas façam investigação. O ponto de vista algumas vezes é conflitante, como estive a referir. Então, falo como antropóloga que tem experiência e trará experiências como investigadora do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia. Bom, como eu estava a dizer, uma das iniciativas do centro que fiz menção, que faço parte, é fazer identificação de tecnologias e transferi-las para as comunidades. E uma das formas, como fiz menção, são os concursos nacionais. Estes concursos nacionais, regra geral, consistem em fazer identificação de soluções inovadoras em diferentes áreas. Já vai na sua 3ª edição, já fizemos na área da horticultura, uso sustentável da água, e este ano elegemos o agroprocessamento. São, na verdade, são, por exemplo, soluções que reduzem tempo de processamento de alimentos ou ainda câmaras de... foram também desenvolvidas câmaras de conservação que permitiram a conservação de alimentos por mais de 30 dias em locais que sequer tinha energia elétrica. Foram desenvolvidas plantas nativas para luta contra pragas e outras soluções inovadoras que foram descobertas. Este programa é uma forma de promover a inovação, a criatividade, seja por pessoas alfabetizadas, seja por que têm recurso a conhecimento científico, seja por pessoas não alfabetizadas. A minha inquietação e o que me fez eleger este tema de descolonizar teorias e conceitos para uma inclusão digital surge neste mapeamento destas iniciativas inovadoras e por isso trazia esta breve contextualização que eu tive a oportunidade de fazer parte do levantamento. Lá vi tipologias diferentes de pessoas, tipologias diferentes de mulheres, desde a senhora Virgínia, que era uma mulher não alfabetizada, que fazia recurso ao conhecimento geracional ou ancestral, como nós quisermos chamar, para fazer mistura de 13 plantas nativas que permitiram a luta contra pragas, até a estudantes de ensino superior, ou seja, são grupos diferentes que têm formas de pensar e de ser também diferentes, formas de produzir estas inovações, recursos para produzir estas inovações também diferentes. Enfim, estas são algumas iniciativas que eu poderia mencionar. E esta variedade de soluções encontradas nos concursos mostram, ao meu ver, que tecnologia não significa apenas tecnologia ou inovação no sentido softwareizado, se assim quisermos chamar, ou não tem relação necessariamente com aplicativos ou com códigos digitais, mas também e fundamentalmente constituem processos de organização social. São constitutivas de determinado lugar. E é aí que, para mim, começa o problema. Que problemas é que eu identifico aqui? Primeiro é porque as autoridades reguladoras de patenteabilidade de inovações que atribuem esta categoria de inovação definem que deve ser considerada a inovação se reunir critérios, três principais critérios de novidade, atividade inventiva, ou seja, as inovações devem ser originais, não devem ser óbvias. E tem que ter aplicabilidade industrial, ou seja, traz esta ideia de vantagem competitiva. Se considerarmos que a ideia de inovação é trazer uma solução tecnológica para o lugar onde eu vivo, por que eu devo então reunir cumulativamente estes três critérios para considerar uma inovação? É meu entendimento que esta forma de definir inovação está ancorada, de alguma forma, a alguns idealismos que não levam em conta algumas dinâmicas contextuais. E padronizar esta forma de pensar acaba ou pode criar potencialmente três principais problemas. O primeiro é que eu acho que acaba singularizando a diversidade de saberes fundados e produzidos ou transmitidos geracionalmente. Segundo problema é que fechar a inovação a estes três critérios define um pensamento único sobre o que é conhecimento válido. E o terceiro e último problema que eu identifico aqui é que obriga a que aquele conhecimento que é útil em determinado local não seja considerado inovação porque não tem aplicabilidade industrial, que é um dos critérios para se chamar inovação. Ou seja, estamos a pensar mais no mercado competitivo e não propriamente para uma solução local. Estou com isso a dizer que não devemos pensar em competitividade, temos que manter as pessoas só a resolverem problemas ou a trazerem soluções locais, não. Mas por que não nos abrirmos para pensar e propor coisas mais locais? Para avançar em direção a uma discussão mais ampla e diversificada sobre digitalização ou inclusão digital e todos os aspectos a ela associados, eu acho que é fundamental contextualizar. Os conceitos devem ser mais contextualizados, mais convidativos, aquelas pessoas que não têm acesso à tecnologia de ponta, mas têm saber nativo. Não têm acesso à tecnologia, mas têm conhecimento nativo. Então, é meu entendimento que o processo deve ser endógeno, deve partir de dentro para fora. Portanto, a inclusão digital não envolve não apenas como posso dizer, a compreensão do impacto de uma determinada tecnologia, mas também e fundamentalmente nas pessoas. Na profunda discussão que trouxe ontem, num outro painel, falamos sobre a necessidade de esquecer a descolonização, porque acabamos agindo como se fôssemos traumáticos, não quiséssemos esquecer da mágoa da colonização. E depois posso falar um pouquinho mais sobre isto já lá mais para o fim. Acho que é importante sair do chavão da ideia de valorização do conhecimento local, conhecimento nativo. Estamos sempre a repetir, devemos valorizar o conhecimento local, devemos valorizar o conhecimento nativo. Mas o que é que isso significa de facto? Fazemos, de facto, valorizamos ou só estamos a fazer repetição de palavras? E esta chamada é também para mim, fundamentalmente, porque eu tenho estado a trabalhar diretamente com isto que estou aqui a mencionar. Eu acho que é importante compreender que inovações, tecnologias, como queiramos chamar, a produção em si deve ser pensada a partir de quem produz, a partir da história destas pessoas que produzem estas tecnologias. Finalmente, eu gostava de propor para pensar, estamos aqui para pensar possibilidades e futuros digitais, pensar futuros feministas mais justos, fundamentalmente, implica voltar para tradições locais. Portanto, é importante, como estava a dizer, abandonar estes chavões da valorização do conhecimento local e fazê-lo de facto, porque já começa a ficar um disco riscado. E por que não, uma segunda proposta é, por que não criar categorias locais ou pegá-las emprestado de contextos que têm desafios similares aos nossos? Conceitos como tecnologia apropriada ou tecnologia social. Este termo de tecnologia apropriada foi trazido por Gandhi, e este de tecnologia social é um conceito brasileiro, que nos mostram que o verdadeiro desenvolvimento não se revela em forma de progresso ou desigualdade social, mas como justiça social. Então, significa com isso que este desenvolvimento deve ser inclusivo, especialmente para a parcela de mulheres mais pobres, em particular. Falo de mulheres, não que não exista outro grupo, mas em particular de mulheres mais pobres. Sim, o conceito em si não muda a posição de país em via de desenvolvimento, mas pode se revelar como um primeiro passo para a inclusão digital. E se quisermos recuperar a sugestão de Michel Foucault, o discurso e a forma como ele se dissemina também conta neste processo de produção de conhecimento. Como estava a dizer, um pouco mais para cima, talvez seja importante, sim, não projetar futuros digitais a partir desta fala de descolonização de conceitos, porque parece este exercício de não superação do trauma da colonização, mas é também importante e é fundamental pensar e aprimorar o que temos a partir de contextos exógenos. E muito obrigada.
Thank you. I think we want to really hear more about that argument, right? About, so to begin with, what is the right term in terms of local, native, indigenous, right? And also thinking about how when we center that, the terms like technology, innovation, these all mean very different things than the way we were talking about it in the conference so far. So you're inviting us to think about that a lot. And then we have Angela online. Please play.
Good afternoon, everyone. A big thanks to Marcia and Shine and the rest of the organizing team for the invitation. I'm really excited to be in discussion with the folks on this panel. I'm calling in from Nairobi. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you in person because of travel commitments. So I've recorded these 15-minute remarks in advance. I hope that we can follow along clearly without any internet interference. And I am here in person, so I'm looking forward to participating live during the Q&A. Today, I want to dive into a very specific example of what has become arguably the most ubiquitous piece of knowledge infrastructure, the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI, as a point of entry to explore the infrastructuring of hegemonic power in global knowledge circulation. But before we begin, I want to locate myself, and also acknowledge just how fraught the world is today and the context within which we are all living and working. We're watching overlapping genocides in Palestine, Ethiopia, Sudan, and the Congo, growing global fascism, impending ecological collapse, the list can go on. At the same time, simultaneously, we're also witnessing exciting social movements, intense social moments, led by really next generation activists, especially here in Kenya right now, for those of you following. And my hope is that as we talk about knowledge infrastructures, we are starting from an understanding that all infrastructures, even the seemingly neutral ones, have politics. I hope we discuss these knowledge infrastructures within the broader regional and global moment that we find ourselves in, and the role that they play in shaping or resisting the future. This image has been used to help visualize the unequal and underrepresentation of knowledge globally from particular parts of the world. I'm sorry to say, more recent iterations of this map don't yet look much better. It's a pretty depressing map. But often the conclusion drawn from this image is that the global scientific community needs to work to have more representation from the smaller parts of the world, right? So here you see the continent of Africa is clearly much smaller than it should be, and other parts of the global north are bigger than they should be. We need to bring in and share work by more African researchers, is something I have often heard in response to this map. But what follows from an imperative focused only on greater inclusion of individuals into an existing system? These are images from various initiatives to include more Africans in global scholarly publishing venues over the last few years. And while the issue of under and overrepresentation in global science is not to be dismissed, I find that solutions framed around representation alone miss that the previous slide's map is actually a symptom of a larger problem, not necessarily the problem itself. To me, the map raises many more questions around what knowledge is and isn't captured, what's not included as knowledge that counts, that's valid, and considered real science? What are the benefits and risks of being included in this valid map of science anyway? Who decides which knowledge counts, how it was identified, tagged, counted, represented, and who stewards this knowledge and values, appreciates, and uses it? To me, instead of a visual of how unequal scientific production across geographies is, I read this map as showing the results of inherently inequitable knowledge infrastructures that are owned primarily by those in the so-called global north that position certain people and places over others. I'll give you a little taste by looking at these images, but the Open Research Africa platform is actually owned, if you dig deeply into the legal information, by Taylor and Francis. And if you look at Scientific African, which is a peer-reviewed open access journal, and you dig a little deeply into the fees, you see that there's a $510 article publishing charge. So I start my talk with my conclusion. Those of us concerned with feminist and decolonizing knowledge need to look not only at who is doing research work, but equally important, turn our critical gaze on the structures through which scholarly knowledge circulates. Who owns, designs, and makes decisions about these structures through which we share knowledge? All of the initiatives for including Africans on that previous slide trace directly or indirectly back to global North institutions that own the knowledge infrastructure on which Africans are being included. So if we follow their agenda, one day we might have a perfectly geographically representative map. But to me, that will still be a depressing map if the whole knowledge system is governed and owned by the usual powers. And here we have a beautiful illustration by Julia Forsyth, play off of Elsevier's logo, just showing that this is in fact not a healthy ecosystem of knowledge. We have visible barriers, but we also have hidden and invisible barriers, ideological, political, economic barriers that prevent people from being able to actually have broader and more diverse knowledge sharing. So who in fact are the usual powers? For those who may not yet be familiar with the political economy of scholarly publishing landscape, the next two slides will stand in as a quick whirlwind intro. There is a growing work that I hope that you get interested in that documents the privatization of scholarly infrastructure. So in 2015, Vincent Laviere and team found that Elsevier, Wiley Blackwell, Springer, this was before the merger that they had with Nature, and Taylor and Francis published more than half of the scholarly journal literature. These publishers used to rely heavily on subscription revenue, where libraries and universities paid for access to published content for their readers. But this model has, over the last few years, started to shift. I mean, the model has always been quite high in profits, but it continues to actually become more and more profitable. In 2017, Elsevier made $1.8 billion in journal revenue with a 37% profit margin annually. Springer Nature earned $1.3 billion US dollars with 23% annual profit margin. And really, as I think many of us who contribute to these knowledge economies know, the high profit model is founded on often the unpaid labor of academics who generally volunteer our time as authors and reviewers, and we produce this work for publishers for free. In its early days, the open access movement sought to make research outputs available to everyone. And this really was a big threat to big publishers' power and profits. Imagine a world where papers and outputs were shared freely without barriers to access. Unfortunately, big publishers were able to quickly shift their business strategies and reestablish their control of publishing markets. And so today they reap even greater profits thanks to OA market and funder mandates and policies. Research by Butler et al. Last year estimates that globally from 2015 to 2018, authors paid over $1 billion US dollars in publication fees to the big five commercial publishers to have their work published open access. So not only is open access opening new markets for these publishers, but scholarly publishing firms are continuing to expand their portfolio and business. They are no longer just publishers, but increasingly now data analytics companies and core scholarly data infrastructure providers. Their platforms target individuals, scientific communities, and institutions like universities offering both preservation and publishing capacities. Essentially, publishers are innovating in order to continue to shore up their centrality in this whole knowledge ecosystem and their power and profits. This image illustrates the full workflow from research to data management to publication to evaluation. You can see listed up at the top there. And Elsevier and others have used acquisition to become full workflow end-to-end solutions. So here you see logos of many formerly open tools that have since been bought up and consolidated under one scholarly publishing company. So in this case, everything within this cloud bubble is now owned by Elsevier. You might recognize some of these logos. There's Mendeley, there's Plemex, Aries. Many of these are services that we use on an everyday basis. And in fact, it's hard not to use them as they are increasingly now opt-out rather than opt-in systems. So of course, there are issues with lock-in because once we invest our time and our data and our publishing outputs, it's increasingly hard to get out of these systems, and they are all owned by the same body. So if you couple this infrastructural development with the rise also in funder and government policies that are increasingly requiring researchers to openly publish their data, code, and papers, you find that these platforms, these private platforms, are being relied upon and even funded, often by public funds, to provide these services. The growing privatization of these platform systems that have become a ubiquitous part of global knowledge infrastructure is something that still is under discussed, I think, and something we really need to wrestle with as research users and producers. So I hope I've shared enough context to make clear the stakes of the case that I'm now going to dive more concretely into. So in what follows, I just want to briefly share what is a digital persistent identifier, share a brief history of the DOI in particular, and then cover the implications for scholarly publishing infrastructure on the African continent. So what's a DOI exactly? The DOI is one of a handful of persistent identifier schemes, or PIDs, which can be cited to retrieve digital objects over a long period of time. The initial rationale behind PIDs was because the average URL lifetime is about 100 days, after which you start to get more and more errors and the kind of dreaded, we cannot find that file or that site. So if you want to have digital resources that persist, it was decided that, we need another kind of identifier. But even so-called persistent digital IDs, they still break. There are many myths about persistent identifiers that I don't have enough time to get into here, but I recommend a book chapter that Leslie Chan and I co-authored, which you can get from the QR code on your screen. So on the screen, you also see some examples of different kinds of PIDs. You have ARCs, you have DOIs, of course, handle system, and Perl system. And so just to show that DOIs are but one of many types of different PIDs. And in each PID, there is kind of a distinguishing label to illustrate that this URL is meant to be persistent. But despite the plethora of many schemes, today the DOI has become a hegemonic standard. Why is that? What are the implications? Why does it matter? So a brief history of the DOI. I really want to show kind of how the DOI became so ubiquitous in digital persistent identifiers. It wasn't by chance. In the late 1990s, the Euro-American publishing industry that I signaled earlier on articulated a need to uniquely and unambiguously identify scholarly content. This arose from worries about rights management, especially given the open nature of the internet, which was just rising at that period and becoming really widespread. And so the dominant kind of publishing industry was very concerned that their rights management was going to be disrupted by the open internet. In 1998, the DOI Foundation was incorporated to understand and then advocate for the taking up of the DOI as a standard. And then the first DOI registration agency, the most popular agency called Crossref, started in 2000. And Crossref has been a reason that the DOI has been taken up and become hugely popularized. By 2012, the DOI became adopted as an international standard. And as an ISO standard, it really helped push it forward as a kind of ubiquitous best practice. This is despite the fact that from a technical perspective, there is no benefit over any other PID scheme. In fact, there are several good reasons not to go with the DOI. But today, there are well over 257 million DOI names that have been assigned and counting. So to assign a DOI to academic work requires going through a registration agency. And I mentioned that Crossref is the largest. Here you can also see DataCite is another one. And I've also indicated a Chinese agency. There are several others as well, many of them from national governments. And these agencies use the policies and common infrastructure provided by the International DOI Foundation that continues to control the system itself. So it is a centralized system, quite opaquely governed. To become a registration agency, you must first meet the contractual obligations of the DOI system and be willing and able to pay a hefty annual fee to become a member of the system. Not surprisingly, therefore, many of the DOI Foundation members are some of the largest power brokers of the publishing world. And to illustrate the kind of entanglement between the DOI system and ecosystem and the big commercial publishers, I'll just note that the managing agent of the foundation since 2015 worked for Elsevier for 20 years prior to joining the DOI Foundation. Karen Hunter of Elsevier, who is a founding member of the International DOI Foundation board, also quoted in a 2009 pamphlet saying, "There really wasn't any question about it working because all the big players were in it from the start." So I want to point out just one more thing. Did you know that there is a fee attached to assigning every single DOI? So not only is there an annual membership fee, there is a fee to every single DOI that's assigned to an object. And the fee runs, anywhere from a few cents to $1. But imagine how much that adds up to when every single DOI assignment carries a cost. The cost might not be borne by the individual researcher, hence why maybe many of you didn't realize that every time you have a paper with a DOI, it's paid for. But by the country or institution seeking to assign DOIs, many of them are then receiving bills on a quarterly basis for all of their DOI assignments. So I hope you're becoming aware now that the uptake of the DOI as an international standard is not necessarily due to any technical advantage over another similar persistent identifier scheme. Rather, its uptake globally attests to the market power and political resources available to the publishing conglomerate that has been lobbying for the endorsement of their technical object at the international level. So despite rhetoric about wanting to help Africa be better represented in science, we need to be really wary. The powerful publishing sector, what they really want are more users to be locked into their infrastructure, more users that they can use and sell as data points for their analytic tools. So while persistent digital identifiers are important for the sharing of scholarly objects, don't get me wrong, the positioning of the DOI as the de facto standard is particularly worrying. It further centralizes scholarly infrastructure in the hands of dominant publishing corporations headquartered in global north cities. And if African universities, journals, and researchers are to build and strengthen their own national and regional knowledge infrastructures, a critical gaze is needed not only on the visible areas of publishing, remember the very first map that I opened with, but also the invisible infrastructures, the institutions, the technical systems, and the international norms. I'm really worried by recent work I've observed, trends perhaps, they're good intentioned, but maybe they don't fully realize the stakes, and they've begun to help expand DOI infrastructure and uptake on the African continent. So here on this slide, you see the Africa PID Alliance, and who are the global partners? Crossref, DataCite, DOI Foundation, which, as you've just learned, are actually very intertwined with each other. Kenyans are currently protesting the leasing of the national airport, it was last week, JKIA, to a private Indian company for 30 years. The deal would pay the private company an 18% annual return over 3 decades. And this is not unlike the Nairobi Expressway that was built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation several years ago. The toll road cost Kenyan taxpayers $170 million. China pumped 600 million more into the project, and in return, China will collect the toll fees for the next 27 years. While scholarly infrastructure does not appear as present as this kind of physical infrastructure, the same thing is happening on the continent. External, already well-resourced actors are flying in, seemingly benevolently, with rhetoric to help Africa, when in fact, they are benefiting with massive profits. My hope is that Africa-based scholars can begin to invest and collaborate on developing scholarly publishing infrastructure projects with indigenous actors, perhaps with alternative aims than simply to be accepted into the global science stage, and instead to ensure knowledge outputs are regenerative for the communities from which they're sourced. With that, I look forward to more discussion with you all and think together around this. There are a couple resources here, the paper that goes into much more detail here on the top, and an older paper on ethnographic archiving that I think might also be relevant to several in the audience here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So we have until 12:45 to talk to each other. I mean, my immediate response to Angela's presentation is, oh my God, as part of the global science, whatever it is, publish less. Less is more, I think is my immediate reaction, which let's get a round of questions, comments, reflections, and I'll take a round. Please raise your hand so we could get the mic to you. We have one in the middle with a black top. Can someone get a mic to? And we have Lisa. So, but in the middle, in the back, can you just keep your hand up so we could get a mic to you? And then we saw a row of hands in that corner, so we'll definitely move in that direction. Is there a mic, or do I need to get her a mic? Okay.
Okay.
No, you can go. You can go. Oh, me? No, you want to speak. Oh, thank you so much for that lovely panel. My question is to the first speaker, the one who spoke about algorithm. Oh, hectic. My question is to the first speaker who spoke about algorithm resistance. So you were talking about content being taken and not cited. So I know right now there's like a discourse on TikTok where there's Nara Smith and the South African black lady who lives in the rural area and is always making the meals from scratch, and her stealing content and then cooking it in Chanel. So now what I'm wondering is, it seems like a lot of people, particularly in the global south and people who live in the rural areas, communities, or black women in general, their work is being stolen by European, American super houses who then take it and then manufacture it, wear Louis Vuitton and the expensive stuff. And when black women or African women try to sue, then they've got the big lawyers which you can't afford to fight them and say that the work is theirs. So to what extent does then the system in itself play a role in being complicit in protecting the thieves, right, from being able to steal from the people who have no means? Because all of us know the facts. We know who's the thief, we know who's stealing from who's taking the content, who's redoing the dances, who's reimagining someone else's imagination. But it's like justice is never being served because of the color, the amount of money you have, your race, your gender, your sexuality, how you look, how you speak, you know. So all these privileges then play a form in you, then injustice being done on you. Can you touch on that? Yeah.
Thank you. Where's the mic? Okay, great. Please go ahead. And then Lisa.
All right, thanks for the very insightful talks. My question is also to the first speaker. On algorithms, I know that, you know, they say technology is basically a social construct. You know, I think on the first day we talked about how if you don't have democracy in real life, more or less the democratic space on social media will also be non-existent. To, you know, the same extent maybe if we objectify women, maybe because of cultural or whatever social issues, then doesn't that become hardwired into these algorithms? And then it doesn't become an issue of the algorithm, but a social issue that we should maybe self-introspect and get really to the root cause of issues. But I do know that they are representation issues. For instance, only 22% of the people working in AI technologies are women. So maybe how, you know, these technologies are curated, then that becomes maybe an issue also. But I do believe that at the very core of this, it's a social issue. How some, you know, races, some cultures objectify their women, and then it ends up being reproduced, you know, on an online space. That was just my little pushback on that. And then, secondly and lastly, you mentioned how, you know, algorithms kind of show you what your preferences are, and they kind of desist from, you know, showing you anything that is a dissenting opinion, right? But doesn't that, I mean, you mentioned that as almost like a good thing, but doesn't that create echo chambers? And don't we just end up reinforcing our own beliefs, whether or not they are wrong or right? And isn't that exactly, you know, at a social level, what's exactly wrong with the world today, where, you know, tolerance is at risk because of those very echo chambers, and we're so quick to cancel people who, you know, have, you know, different perspectives. Thank you.
I think you had a question right beside, right? Do you want to pass on?
Hi. I've got two questions, and they go to the last speaker. The first one, I would like to know how the DOI system can be adapted to better serve the diverse linguistic and cultural context of African countries. And for the last one, in which way DOIs help bridge the knowledge gap between African researchers and the global academic community? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to go, and then we'll...
Bom dia. Bom, eu não tenho exatamente uma questão, mas é um comentário. Bom, eu vou começar em dizer que o desenvolvimento tecnológico deve ser inclusivo ao nível da produção e expansão de diferentes tipos de conhecimento. Há uma necessidade de se tecnologizar os conhecimentos locais. Estávamos aqui a falar, o segundo painelista, a falar dessa necessidade de se conhecer e de se inteirar dos conhecimentos locais. Há uma necessidade também de se cientificar esses conhecimentos, muitas das vezes focados em diferentes tipos de saber, focados na medicina tradicional, na produção agrícola, na sustentabilidade. Muitas das vezes são atitudes, são conhecimentos que a maior parte dos países africanos tem adotado como forma de sobreviver. Há uma necessidade mesmo de olhar para esse tipo de conhecimento, procurar formas de de publicar, de divulgar e de cientificar ainda mais. Nós vamos perceber que com o surgimento da Covid-19, surgiu muitos métodos africanos que foram adotados como forma de mitigar esse vírus. E é esse o meu comentário e obrigado.
Should we take one mic for in the middle of the room, Lisa, with a... Oh, there's a... Okay.
Yes, thank you. I guess my my comment is really, it's a comment more than a question. And if it's a question, it's maybe a question to Eileen Hunt. I would like to come back to the messages that you gave us. And I'm going to start with Ms. Ya's intervention, because I think what you showed us very clearly is kind of the extent to which social media is suffused with power relations, right? And so there's exclusions happening there, but then there's also kind of this counter activity that is happening. And the exclusions happen as a result of the training of the algorithm. So it's the, to get back to Eileen's metaphors there, you know, it's the child that is being trained. And Eileen, you told us the child needed to be trained, right? But the child is being trained. And, you know, is there a right way and a wrong way of training? And how should we think about that? So I would like to, you know, whoever wants to talk about that.
Should we get a round of responses from the panelists, and then we'll come back to the room.
Thank you. So one of the challenges is this is such a changing landscape. You know, we saw with the purchase of X how quickly hate speech was kind of reintroduced without censorship. And so, you know, part of this for me is posing the questions, posing these challenges, but I don't have solutions. I think that every once in a while we'll see kind of really bright, shining moments of resistance. So when it comes to stealing, there was a case of a white social media influencer who, I think she had claimed to have invented the silk bonnet or something. There was something. And so it was, you know, she got mainstream media coverage. And so black women were like, no. We've been using the silk bonnet to protect our hair. And so this was a case where it made it to the mainstream, where there was pushback and, I don't want to say retraction, but correction of that narrative. That often doesn't happen, but there are those really kind of inspiring moments when it does happen. I know as a feminist going on to social media into my kind of network, it's often a source of affirmation, support. You know, I've had cases where I've been, because Wikipedia was just like one of the top 5 websites, where I had a bit of a battle with Wikipedia over some stuff that we were trying to get on there about African women. And so I went immediately to then Twitter to just express frustration. And then the people on Wikipedia attempted to go onto Twitter and like punish me more. And I said, oh, no, this is the wrong space. Now you're in my house. And on Wikipedia, where the vast majority of editors are white men, I was powerless. But the minute they came onto Twitter, and then it became, oh, we don't feel safe. You know, one of the young men who was coming at me was a teenager, and somehow people found out and began to like, how are you going to try to discipline this, you know, discipline me? And so then he started saying he doesn't feel safe and he feels like he's going to be attacked. And I'm like, no one's going to hurt you. Like, so that was also a moment where I felt affirmed because my community stood up for me. I didn't, you know, so there are those, but more often that doesn't happen. More often we are trolled. And as far as, you know, the algorithm representing society, it absolutely does. The people who are designing the algorithm are mostly men, and they do have their own biases, and those biases are put into the algorithm. And that is, you know, so it reflects the problems in society. I do know that with the feeds and us and kind of this being an echo chamber, Instagram benefits the longer I stay on their app. So if I go on their app and every time I'm seeing really, you know, anti-woman rhetoric, racist rhetoric, I'm less likely to go on. So they want to keep me on. So they keep feeding me things that I want to see. And that has given rise to the problem that we have today, the whole, you know, alternative facts and people putting stuff out there on social media that just isn't true, but because it feeds my own preconceived ideas, it, you know, I'm consuming it and thinking, aha, this is how it is because this is on my feed and this is what dominates my feed, so therefore it must be dominating the whole platform. So that does become dangerous because it's a way for politicians and other individuals to kind of push destructive narratives, racist narratives, homophobic narratives. So yeah, I mean, I honestly don't have an answer. It's problematic, but it's something I know I'm hoping that we're able to, I don't even know how to even begin to address it because there's so much money. I mean, Facebook, which owns Instagram, and of course X and TikTok are making massive amounts of money, so there's no incentivizing to change. They've been challenged. I know in the US, they've, you know, but it's still, so there are those bright spots. But I think awareness is important, and you know, it's definitely an issue that we need to somehow address. I just don't have the solution for it.
Bom, primeiro, obrigada pelos comentários. Acho que não tenho nenhuma questão em particular para responder, mas queria fazer dois breves comentários, por cima dos comentários. Primeiro é sobre a cumplicidade das autoridades nos roubos de ideias, que foi, desculpe, não retive o nome da primeira interveniente. Gostava de comentar sobre este aspecto, porque a cumplicidade no roubo de ideias tem um pouco a ver com lá embaixo. Como é que as autoridades reguladoras nomeiam? E voltamos à discussão que trouxe aqui. Tem de reunir cumulativamente alguns critérios para se definir que é inovação. Porque imagine, tenho uma inovação, vivo onde eu vivo, e posso trazer, inclusive, o exemplo que mencionei durante a apresentação da senhora que fez uso das 13 plantas nativas. Se este conhecimento não é documentado, não é patenteabilizado, existe esta expressão em português? Patenteado. Se ele não é patenteado, ele está sujeito a ser levado por qualquer pessoa. Não está patenteado. Então, se nós já estamos a dizer lá atrás, parece uma discussão absurda, mas é importante voltar para lá atrás para perceber o que está a ser definido primeiro como critério para chamar aquilo inovação, e depois, pronto, não é inovação, e então depois vem alguém, pega na ideia e vai. Vamos dizer que roubou? Não roubou porque não estava patenteado. Oficialmente não roubou, mas se nós voltarmos para quem produziu a inovação, foi roubo. Não sei se faz-me perceber. Então é importante também, e volto a repisar a necessidade de fazermos a revisão destes critérios olhando para contextos locais. E, associado a isto, comentaria sobre o último comentário do colega que falava de tecnologizar o conhecimento local. Talvez eu diria localizar a tecnologia, por que não? Por que temos que tecnologizar o conhecimento e não localizar a tecnologia? Porque é sempre, neste processo de produção de conhecimento, não é de diálogo, tem que vir uma por cima da outra, é a tecnologia que tem que vir por baixo do conhecimento local. Será? Talvez não, mas é um aspecto que eu acho que temos que repensar para não sermos injustos com quem faz a produção deste conhecimento. Obrigada.
Angela, please go ahead. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, sorry, I'm switching between the interpretation, so slight delay. I hope you all can hear me okay. Really enjoying the presentations and also the questions. I will start with the question that was directed to me, which I believe was around how might we adapt the DOI system to account for linguistic and cultural diversity on the African continent. I think I would argue that there are limits to how much some of these entrenched systems inbuilt so that the powerful remain powerful, how much they should be adapted versus broken away from. I think one of the points that I hope you all heard was that there are multiple persistent identifier schemes. The DOI is but one and is not necessarily even technically better than any of the rest. It's just that it is the one that all of the powerful hegemonic publishers have already decided is the one that they are going to back and that they are going to use to promote their agenda. The big players, these same big players, are innovating to stay in control, right? So they are in fact adapting their system so that it can account for linguistic diversity, so that it can account for the cultural diversity. They are actually hosting and partnering with various folks on the continent to run webinars to show how the DOI can be assigned to not just scholarly outputs, but also to traditional knowledge outputs, to remains, to a whole range of different objects in the world that can then get their DOI assigned to it. And you'll remember I said every DOI has a cost, right? So again, the more objects they can assign DOIs to, the better. It in some ways just helps to capture further more of these diverse knowledges, standardize them, and put them into the existing system. So I'm not sure that the goal should be that. It might make individual groups, national governments feel good that they are now represented at this global science stage, but we really need to ask who is governing this global science stage. And at the end of the day, who is making the big money and profiting off of all of this? It's really important, I think, to turn our gaze on the infrastructure and who owns it, not just who is represented in it. I think the second part of that question was how do we bridge the gap between Africa and kind of global science, I think may have been the term. And I would push that question further. I think that, drawing on Pauline Hontonji, who's written from the 90s about extroverted science and really calling into question the way so much of the knowledge built on the African continent is still aiming to be read and taken up in the West. So, extroverted in terms of for outside gaze, thinking more about what kind of more indigenous science might look like, right? How can we actually make sure that the knowledge systems are helping to be re-injected into the communities from which they are sourced? And I think here I'm kind of referring to this critique of helicopter science, right? But I think that it's more than just the individual body that is coming to collect the knowledge. I think this is a methodological issue, and it's an issue of the knowledge structures and how so much of
the resources, whether it's data or otherwise, is often sucked out of communities for purposes of being published in other places that are not meant to be read by the communities that are actually engaging in the research. So personally, I think it's really important that we flip away from extroverted science models and think more about how do we actually build regenerative science, science that is useful, informed by agendas from the kind of grassroots, for lack of a better term, but how knowledge outputs can be really enriching for the communities that they come from.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to just start this round of questions with our audience members online. And there's a comment by Tigist. So the comment is, considering AI as child machine, I hope I got this right, with the intention to get a better outcome and improvement, might be misleading primarily because it hides the human persons who are behind the coding of this algorithm. Algorithm bias is not a machine fault. It is an intentional design made by people, often white men from global north. Disentangling this will help to put things in perspective and engage with racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other atrocities. So is there any other question online before I return to the room? Yeah, at the end. So maybe we'll collect some questions, and then we'll give Eileen a chance to chat, and then.
Shine, I think there's one more.
Oh, is there one more?
Right before.
Sorry.
From Amanda.
I'm not seeing it. Do you? Oh, my question may apply to the whole workshop and panel. Sorry. Actually, Angela, do you want to read it? Because I'm having a difficult time getting. Thank you.
Sure. Let me try to read it. Interesting and insightful conversation. Amanda Odoy writes, I was wondering, what is our take home? What do we leave here with all these knowledge? We seem to be very knowledgeable about AI and its implications for women and feminist futures. How are we, or can we, use this knowledge to develop or create counter-narrative platforms and hold these spaces accountable? Is this stereotypical algorithms a problem of men as developers or lack of gender-aware persons at the table? Do we have women developers feeding into these stereotypes? How can publications or these knowledge become a resource for these developers to alter knowledge or hold them accountable? Is this knowledge just going to remain in the space or amongst us? Do we have suggestions, for example, around pushing algorithms, maneuvering these publication spaces to push some of these critical lenses?
Great, thank you. Asanda, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, thanks. This session, really, really interesting. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I had a couple of questions, actually, but I'm going to try and skip some of them in the interest of time. But the first one is, I'm reminded of the conversation we were having yesterday about open access, especially the last presentation. But in preparation for that work yesterday, I've been following some of the money, like the profits that Taylor & Francis is making. But most recently, where Taylor & Francis is making money recently, selling authors' work to Microsoft so that Microsoft can better their AI system. So it just seems like there's all of these multiple ways in which these companies are just making money out of authors without our knowledge. I had no idea about the DOI system. But I wanted to ask the speaker on the conclusion that they sort of gave us, which is around developing African publishing infrastructures. And I'm just wondering, sitting here, one of the things we talked about yesterday was the history of what is the impact of defunding of higher education across the continent. And I'm thinking more practically about what that would mean in that context of defunding of higher education, where we're supposed to be, again, asking the same governments that have not been funding some of the most basic things at our universities to help build these infrastructures. That's the one. But the second one is more external, this gatekeeping that you spoke about. I think it's Angela. That the gatekeeping is so real, right? It's not just that they have all of these rights to do the DOI, but also that they are also preventing other new actors from coming in You talked about very high, hefty fees that one has to pay. So that's the second one. The third part of that is the real impact, enduring impact of colonization in the continent is also that we're not necessarily in conversation with each other in the continent. I mean, when you talk to people in South Africa, they know very little about scholarship that's coming from, I'll use the very controversial francophone words, lusophone parts. So there's no real proper in the continent, like real conversation that's going on in the continent because of these enduring legacies of colonization. And then the last part is around commoditization of knowledge, that it seems also, and I'm sure this is not what you're saying, but this is what I heard, so it's just more to correct me on this one, that it seems what you're suggesting, I'm not sure if it's still falling within the very privatization of knowledge when you're talking about this, or more public, making it more public. But I'm wondering about actually just really thinking more decommodification kind of ways of doing this thing, if there are such things, because I'm thinking here, are there more global common infrastructures that we need to be thinking about? Yes, I get the argument around making it more continental or more global south, but I'm just thinking also about also getting out of these models that are making so much money out of the work that we get absolutely nothing out of, except that we read each other and it's so exciting to read other people's ideas, but actually we get beyond that, not much else. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll get a round of questions. Can you, sorry, I'm not a best. There's a question, hand in the back. Is the mic going to...
Hi, thank you so much. The whole conference, of course, but this panel has been so interesting, and I don't think it's really a question, but it's sort of a way of thinking together. There are three things that I think are emerging here from the talks, and then they kind of relate to the three panelists. One is about theft, and it was sort of hinted at in all presentations, theft of content and creativity, I guess, and that makes me think about the sort of the global unequal, not just infrastructure, but also when does knowledge become knowledge, like in whose mouth, there is mansplaining, I guess there is also whitesplaining. So when we get to say things, it's not science, it's not knowledge, but then when other people say the same things, then it becomes knowledge. So that, yeah. The other thing is the whole unequal infrastructure and capital. So Katya, you're talking about patent. I mean, we talked about commodification now. Like, there's a very specific logic when you need to patent things. It's individual, so it's not shareable, it's not open. So it's a very specific capitalist logic that we might be buying into. So rather than thinking about the criteria for becoming something patented so that it cannot be stolen, I think we need to think about it critically. Is this a logic that we want to buy into? Is this how we want to create and recognize science? And the third thing is indigenous knowledge and epistemology. So in the picture that was shown in your presentation, the part that talked about, I guess it was not indigenous epistemologies, but sort of the epistemologists that are left to the side, it was plants. So indigenous, it's alluding to nature, to ancestrality. Katya talked about ancestrality. But there are very important, and indigenous, sometimes it's very complicated, because what are we talking about when we're talking about indigenous? Like in Mozambique, what does indigenous mean, right? This means different things, and so in Mozambique, I think we're referring to rural communities, and we're thinking about ancestrality, we're thinking about connection to nature, but we as Mozambicans are discussing important things related to governance, politics, health, both in terms of sort of medical sciences, but also sociality, and these things are produced by us, and I don't know if we are considered indigenous, and if our knowledge and the way we are producing and thinking issues around language and how to term things, discussions about gender, and whether the discussions about gender apply to the way we think gender in our societies. These are important things that we're living today that might not qualify as ancestral or as indigenous, but these are being done by us, and this is, we think about us that should not sort of, we shouldn't have this fascination or fetishized idea of where to get knowledge, and it's this mythical past and is connected to our biological beings and relation to nature, because it comes from a very specific understanding of who we are. And it kind of puts us in a place that can only relate to nature and not to complex ideas and philosophy, etc. So, yeah.
Thank you. What I'll do is collect a lot more questions and then give the final opportunity for the panelists to respond, including Eileen. But you had the mic with you earlier. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, if we can just pass mic to the next person after you're done, sure. So that would be good. There are 2 mics in the room, so we
just a quick question. I want to follow up on the idea that was presented by the third speaker about alternative indigenous publishing and what exactly is meant by that and how it could be achieved. And then the second question relates to Feminist Africa and IFJP, and where do they fit into this complex publishing scene? Thank you.
Okay, where's the other mic? Okay.
Thank you. My question, I'm going to shift it a bit, and this is about mental health, especially for activists who are in the spaces, as you had mentioned about your experiences, and sometimes we have activists who've turned to be content creators, and they're actually earning from these platforms. But also, what does that mean in terms of their mental health? Because as we know that there's been a lot around gender-based violence and abuse and violence, which is online, and how this is impacting women's health, mental health, and whether there are available spaces, especially for women or activists, that they are utilizing, because at times you find even access to mental health facilities is usually either very expensive, sometimes it's not even accessible, or even people don't even know about it. So are there spaces that feminists or the movement has created in terms of how to deal with mental health as activists? And also given the examples that you've been mentioning about what is happening in Kenya, because I know that it has been quite a difficult time for activists.
Who has the other mic? Is there any other questions in the room? I saw tons of hands earlier, and then they just kind of disappeared. Okay, Eileen, do you want to come in here and respond? And can someone get a mic to the front? Okay, hold on.
Thank you. Those are wonderful questions. I wanted to address the one that mentioned Alan Turing's conception of the child machine. In my book, Artificial Life After Frankenstein, I argued that Turing was really prescient for his ethical insights into the development of AI. So remember, Turing was persecuted for being a homosexual Englishman, and some people think he may have committed suicide, because of that persecution, that legal persecution. Although it is debated in the scholarly literature whether he did commit suicide. His mother went to her grave asserting he did not commit suicide. It was an accidental poisoning that caused his death. That said, he was legally prosecuted for being gay. And we have to keep that in mind as feminist theorists, because I think Turing, even though some of his thinking is limited on the ethical side, and we can't expect him to give us all the answers on ethics and politics, especially when we're looking at the world from the perspective of the global South. I do think there's a lot there that we can resource and use for our purposes for theories of global justice that are culturally sensitive and are concerned with theorizing AI from the perspective of the global South. So I just want to start there. I also want to flag there's a lot of interesting work being done in feminist philosophy of AI right now on Turing, in both engaging him sympathetically but also critiquing him. And so in my book, I tried to do both. I tried to say this idea he had of the child machine has some really interesting synergies with Mary Shelley in particular, but there are also some important limitations that we need to point out. And for his theory to really work for us, we have to have some feminist tweaks to the theory. So what I suggested in my book is that in order to avoid any form of AI or computer programming to have built-in prejudices, whether those are racial prejudices or sexual prejudices or gender prejudices, class prejudices, national prejudices, and so on. What we need to do is from the very get-go, in the way we design the programming itself, the education, the training, we have to have an awareness, of the dangers of prejudice itself. And this is why I think the feminist thought of Mary Wollstonecraft is so instructive here and so important for Mary Shelley's view of what AI or even just children could be if we raised them in a world in which we got them to think critically about prejudice from the very beginning of life. Mary Wollstonecraft was a powerful critic of prejudice of all sorts. And thought the purpose of education itself was to train people to think critically about prejudice from the very beginning of life. So I think we could take his idea, Alan Turing's idea of the child machine, give it some feminist tweaks in light of Mary Shelley's vision of education, and perhaps develop better educational systems in which children are learning about computer programming so that they're not developing programs, algorithms, and so on in the future that have built-in racial, gender, and sexual prejudices. Does that make sense? So I don't think Turing gives us everything, but I think we could take the idea of Turing, of the child machine, and use it for feminist ends. Thank you.
And maybe the question here is which feminists, right? And the heterogeneous nature of that. So I'm just going to, is there any other questions before I just return to the panelists for the final round of responses? 2-3 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of take homes, I do want to acknowledge, I think that as someone who's an academic, I think for those of us who are in the classroom, there are options. And so for my Black Women in Pop Culture class, the assignment is to contribute to Wikipedia. So I started having them actually contribute to existing pages that deal with women of African descent. The year that we faced the pushback, we were actually contributing new pages. And the issue is notability. So Wikipedia, if it's not notable, if they don't recognize it, then they will take it down. And so they kept taking our stuff down. One of the groups, Black Women Radicals, I know some of you have been on some of their virtual panels. We were trying to add a page on Black Women Radicals. They kept saying it's not notable. And it's like, and this is a class of predominantly Black women. It's 20 students in the class. On average, only 1 or 2 are men. So it's heavily Black women in the class. And so to tell us that a page on Black Women Radicals, this group that had emerged to have all of these really important online conversations, was not notable enough. And so they kept taking it down, and we were asking for, assistance. And at one point, there was a petition to ban me from Wikipedia for 3 months because I wasn't obeying. And that is when I kind of moved to Twitter, and it kind of took on. And Black Women Radicals on Twitter, some of the members of that organization actually were active. So now we have switched from creating new pages to adding content to existing pages. So sometimes there may be a page on an African feminist, but it's a very short page, or there's problems with citations, and so a student will be assigned to improve that page so we don't have to deal with the notability, because it did cause mental stress. I mean, I was told I was a horrible teacher and who gave me a degree, and like just really like it was being in a space where there was no one who was there for me. So it was tough. So we decided, okay, I'm not putting our students through that, so we're going to contribute. We also in class do assignments where they go on AI, ChatGPT, and say, you know, ask ChatGPT, what is African feminism? And then we'll look at what comes out and we'll say, okay, well, what is problematic? Is there anything problematic? Or we may say, choose an African feminist, Philomena Study, for example, and say, you know, provide me a bio on Philomena Study. So what is problematic? A lot of times AI is wrong, and it provides wrong information. So it teaches students that you cannot depend on AI. So when you're doing an essay, if you submit an essay that was written by AI, you know, there's going to likely be problems. But it's also looking at, over the past couple years that we've been doing this, how AI has changed and adjusted and shifted because it is learning constantly. So I think for me, in terms of take homes, whether, you know, we're working community organizations, whether we're in the classroom, is kind of really making our students aware, young people aware, but also having them be part of the conversation. There are, and I can't think of the names of them now, there are a couple Wikipedia editing groups that one of them, their goal is to increase the content of Africa-related content on Wikipedia. So there are, and they have these edit-a-thons where activists get together and they go on Wikipedia and edit content and revise and all of that. So I think those are some of the ways that I can think of. But yeah, so that's in terms of take-homes.
We're going to Angela. Angela, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm still here, but my internet is saying that it's a little unstable. So I will stay off video now. Hopefully you can hear me. There's so much to discuss. We are running out of time. I've put several links that I think would be of interest based on the questions in the chat, and Shine has said that she will save them, and so please come and get those links from her. One of the links is to African Books Collective. So for those of you who are not familiar with them, that is a great group to read and learn more about. And so when I was referring to kind of indigenous knowledge infrastructures or publishing, I wasn't referring necessarily to kind of content so much as ownership, right? So for me, indigenous means it's not rooted in US-based, Euro-based corporations. That's maybe one way of defining indigenous, is that it is really integral to kind of locally grounded institutions and relationships. And so this is following the lead of Walter Bugoya, who is a big kind of influential leader in African publishing spaces, founder of Mkuki na Nyota Publishers in Tanzania, and he's been part of developing kind of indigenous publishing houses on the continent since independence in the 60s. And so the links that I shared in the chat, one is Publishing in Africa, that really lays out some of the history of this indigenous publishing. And, you know, I'm sure many of you also are familiar with Codesria and their publishing works. Like, these are the kinds of institutions that I think really need to be supported and invested in. We're not starting from nothing, right? Like, there are already such a robust landscape that, unfortunately, because of austerity and IMF measures and, you know, all of the kind of structural adjustment historically and even today, as somebody mentioned, you know, are really gutting these institutions that we in fact need to invest in further. Both, you know, it can be capital, but it can also be our labor, right? Like, we are already investing our labor in these commercial Global North publishers by agreeing to review, by agreeing to publish, by continuing to queue up to be published in these supposedly high impact journals. So like I mean, it's the small things, right? As feminists, we know the personal is political. And so I refuse to do peer review for any of the big five at this point. I am lucky in a way that others are not, because I'm not trying to get tenure. I'm not trying to make it up in these academic systems that reward so narrowly based on where we publish and what we publish, et cetera, et cetera. So I have the freedom to be able to critique and maybe refuse my labor in ways that others cannot. But I think that there are very small, seemingly small ways that if we all do them, they can be more powerful than we imagine them. And so somebody was saying, how do we actually start building these infrastructure? We start by divesting in the existing infrastructure and trying to, you know, not get frozen by all of these big global structures and try to just do what we can, right? And so I am part of a Kenyan collective of women researchers, and we are experimenting with an alternative way of publishing what we're calling database as book. We're partnering with South Africa-based open access publisher called African Minds. And we are really playing around and finding a refuge in our conversations with each other about how we can build alternative publishing infrastructures. Like where are the places we can play and push? So I put a link also to a little bit more on that project that we have. And then the last thing I want to just, sorry if I can, somebody was asking about, you know, alternative paradigms. I think it's really important, and this ties to the other speakers, to realize that these technologies are built based on particular values and ways of seeing the world. And so, for example, the way that our current publishing infrastructure is built depends on this idea of capturing a version of record. What is a version of record? It is the kind of typeset, copy-edited, published version that the publishers control. And they want to say that that is the fixed version and that they are the ones that declare that that is the version, right? But imagine instead we built around a record of versions. Instead of a version of record, a record of versions, right? So those of you who know GitHub, those of you who know other kind of multiple versioning, you can imagine that instead of having just one static version that the publisher has stamped, what if we built around having a record of the multiple versions of knowledge as it shifts and changes? That would really change even the way we start building the infrastructure itself. So lots to talk about. Please reach out.
Sorry, Andrea, sorry, we have to move on. But really appreciate it. She's on chat, and so we can continue the conversation, and we'll give the last word to Katya.
Thank you. Again, Portuguese, sorry. Sorry. Bom, eu já não tenho muito tempo. Gostava só de fazer 2 últimos comentários. Primeiro, que é cada vez mais a ideia da descolonização dos conceitos, a meu ver, mostra que primeiro deve haver reconhecimento da diversidade. Quem são estas pessoas que estão a produzir conhecimento? Como é que estão a produzir? É importante que as instituições responsáveis por fazer o patenteamento, as instituições responsáveis por fazer a disseminação de tecnologias, como aquela instituição que a investigadora faz parte, a investigadora Kátia, não a antropóloga, a que faz parte, é também responsável por tomar em consideração esta questão da diversidade. As pessoas não são simples receptáculos. As pessoas que produzem, as pessoas que recebem esta informação não são receptáculos. Nós vamos educar em literacia digital. Eu mesmo às vezes falava, se calhar até às vezes falo ainda, mas é um vício de linguagem mau. Eu estou a ir educar em literacia digital. Eu vou ensinar. Será que é só este processo de ida de quem está a ir dar conhecimento, ou é um processo também de recepção de conhecimento daquele lugar onde nós estamos a propor a fazer este processo de transformação e inclusão digital. Acho que temos que pensar nisso. O segundo e último ponto é temos que ter atenção à linguagem. Indígena, eventualmente, em um outro contexto, possa parecer bonito, possa parecer convidativo, em outros contextos, eventualmente, não. Eu não sei se aqui falar indígena, se alguém me vier dizer meu conhecimento indígena, eu vou achar que ele é uau. Talvez não. Porque o indígena tem conotações diferentes, olhando para os lugares diferentes, é um pouco quase da pergunta que a Carmelisa colocou, que dá para uma tese dá para fazer uma tese com isso. É importante, eu acho, pensar, porque não podemos reduzir os nomes, perdão, dar determinado tipo de atributo pode reduzir a importância daquilo que é produzido enquanto conhecimento. Obrigada.
Great, thank you so much. And we are just, just slightly over, under 5 minutes over our time. And there's a final announcement from who? Abina? About logistics? Oh, before we do that, can we give everyone a round of applause for the labor?
Good afternoon, everyone. I have 3 announcements to make. So the first one is that if you're self-sponsored and you're traveling tomorrow, please go to the welcome desk and put in your flight details so that we can arrange your transportation from here to the airport. The second one is that if you are traveling tomorrow, unfortunately, we do not have transportation, so you'd have to arrange that yourself. But if you need help, please speak to any of the volunteers. Please speak to any of the volunteers and they will help you. And the third is that we have dinner tonight at, so the bus will arrive at 6 p.m. and it will depart from here at 6:30 p.m. So we have 30 minutes to get on the buses. There are 3. And if you have not RSVP'd yet, please do so. If you need a link, please speak to any of the volunteers or me or anyone else on the logistics committee that you know of, and they'll help you. And so that's the last one. We have some Feminist Africa journals outside. You can pick a copy. You can pick one for your institution, and you only need to fill a form, or it's a sheet. It's a very simple sheet. You just need your name and your details. Thank you.
So lunchtime now, I think. Thank you.
Recording stopped.